the designated federal officer for this meeting. I would like to welcome everyone to the meeting. Before we start, I would like to take the roll call. Dr. Peter Ford.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Aaron Bachowski. Dr. Aaron Bachowski. So he's not here yet. Dr. Hugh Barton.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Mark Borchak. It's not here yet. Dr. Sylvie Broder.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Amin Chan.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Wei Chun Chow.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Matthew Gribble.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Margaret Carragas.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Anna Navis Asian. Dr. Anna Navis Asian. She's not here yet. Dr. Michael Pennell. Dr. Michael Pennell. It's not here yet. Dr. Isaac Paysack.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Gloria Pose.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Christopher States.
Present.
Thank you.
There was a chat note from Aaron Barchowski that he can't unmute.
Oh, he cannot unmute?
Yeah.
Okay. Kirk, I think Kirk is on the call. Maybe he can take care of that. Thank you. So Aaron is here, okay. Dr. Danielle Wilkoff.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Carol Wood.
Present.
Thank you. So we are still missing 3 people. They'll probably join us later. Good afternoon.
I'll
Yes?
watch for them to join and I'll let you know.
Okay. Good afternoon. I am Dr. Diana Wong, and I am the designated federal officer, or the DFO, for the Science Advisory Board Inorganic Arsenic Review Panel. In my role as the DFO, I would like to formally open this public meeting of the Inorganic Arsenic Review Panel. The purpose of this meeting is for the SAB Inorganic Arsenic Review Panel to listen to the agency's presentations on the draft IRIS toxicological review of inorganic arsenic, listen to the public comments, and discuss the charge questions. The SAB is an independent, expert federal advisory committee chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. The SAB is empowered by law, the Environmental Research, Development, and Demonstration Authorization Act, to provide advice to the EPA administrator on the scientific and technical underpinnings of the EPA's decision. FACR and EPA policy require that SAB meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register, and that substantive deliberations and interactions with EPA and the public be conducted in open sections where DFO is present to ensure that the requirements of FACR are met. FACR also requires that public meetings provide an opportunity for oral and written public comments. There is a public comment period noted on the agenda for this meeting where members of the public can register in advance with the SAB staff office to make oral comments. We have 3 registered public speakers for today. Minutes will be prepared to summarize discussions and action items in accordance with requirements of record. The SAB staff office will work with the panel chair to have the official minutes certified so they can be posted on the SAB website. The SAB consists entirely of special government employees appointed by EPA to their positions. As government employees, all the members are subject to all applicable ethics laws and implementing regulations. The SAB staff office has also reviewed other information related to the public statements expressed by experts on this panel related to the advisory activity under consideration. EPA has determined that advisors participating in this meeting have no financial conflicts of interest or appearance of lack of impartiality under ethics regulations related to the topic of this meeting. Now I would like to turn the meeting over to Mr. Tom Brennan, the director of the SAB staff office, to give his welcoming remarks.
And Anna, Dr. Anna Navas-Asian has joined.
Good.
Well, thank you, Diana. And hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this SAB and Organic Arsenic panel meeting. Today, we continue a long peer review relationship between the IRIS program and the SAB, and I'm happy to continue that trend. I'd like to acknowledge the hard work of my EPA colleagues in the Office of Research and Development that led to this day. I know it's a big effort to bring one of these to this stage, so congratulations on that effort, and thank you. I'd also like to thank our panel members for taking time out of your professional schedules to take on this important review. Thank you for your public service. And a special thanks to Dr. Peter Thorne for chairing this activity. Peter, everyone knows it's a lot of work to be the chair, and thank you for your stepping into a leadership role. It's much appreciated.
My pleasure.
And I'd also like to thank members of the public who commented in writing and those who are here today to share their comments to the panel. Public participation is a critical component of SAB activities, and I thank you for your engagement. I'd also like to thank my teammates at the SAB staff office for all their efforts to make this meeting a reality. I say this every time, but it takes a lot of work to organize these events, and we have such a great team, and I thank you all. A special thanks to Dr. Diana Wong, who was the DFO for this review. And finally, I'd like to thank our contractors within DINA and SCI. Your technical support is always appreciated. So this is such a great team effort to support these meetings. So thank you all. Now I'm going to pass the meeting over to our chair, Dr. Thorne. Take it away.
All right, thank you very much. Let me echo Dr. Brennan's comments, thanking the panel for serving on this. And as he said, we're all busy, but this is really important work, and I'm really glad that we have such a distinguished panel to serve in this review. So what we're going to do first is just go around the table, the virtual table, and introduce ourselves. And we'll keep it brief because the bios are on the website, so people can read those. But I'll start just to give a flavor for what we're looking for. And so I'm Peter Thorne. I'm at the University of Iowa, where I'm the University of Iowa Distinguished Chair and Professor in the Department of Occupational and Environmental Health. I also lead the Human Toxicology Program, and my primary areas of expertise are exposure science and pulmonary toxicology. And so, Dr. Aaron Burkowski, can you go next? And hopefully you can unmute.
Yeah, I believe I'm on now. I'm Aaron Barchowski. I am a professor in environmental and occupational health at the University of Pittsburgh. And my area of expertise is in arsenic toxicology, especially with cardiovascular and metabolic diseases.
Okay, very good. I think Dr. Mark Borsuk hasn't joined yet, correct? Okay, Dr. Sylvie Bruder.
Apologies, technical difficulties for a second. New devices in the new year. I'm Sylvie Brodeur. I'm a professor in the Department of Agronomy at Purdue University. I'm on the SAB's Ag Committee. And perhaps my most relevant expertise for this panel is systematic review and meta-analysis.
Okay, very good. I think I skipped past Dr. Hugh Barton.
Hi, I'm retired from Pfizer and EPA, so I have experience on both the pharmaceutical side and the environmental side. I did physiologically based pharmacokinetic modeling and pharmacodynamic modeling.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Eamon Chen.
Hi, I'm professor of epidemiology from University of Pennsylvania. So my expertise is in environmental epidemiology. I study heavy metals, including arsenic, lead, and cadmium, and pregnancy outcomes and child development. I co-directed the Philadelphia Regional Center for Children's Environmental Health.
Great, thank you. Dr. Wei-Chin Chao.
Hello, my name is Wei-Jin Zhao. I'm the assistant professor of environmental health at University of California, Riverside. My expertise is to development and computational modeling, especially for the physiological pharmacokinetic-based PPK model and AI model to help in the risk assessment. Thank you.
Okay, great. Dr. Matt Gribble.
Hello, I'm an associate professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. I'm also their associate chief for research in occupational, environmental, and climate medicine. And I'm also a diplomate of the American Board of Toxicology.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Margaret Corregas.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Margaret Karagis. I'm a professor and chair of epidemiology at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth College. I am an epidemiologist who studies life course epidemiology, and particular the molecular epidemiology of arsenic throughout my career.
Thank you. Dr. Anna Navas-Isyan.
Hello, everybody. I am Anna Navas-Isyan. I am a professor of environmental health sciences at Columbia University. I am an epidemiologist by training, and my focus, among other metals, has been on arsenic and especially cardiovascular and metabolic outcomes, and also with an interest and experience in meta-analysis and dose response meta-analysis and systematic reviews. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I see Dr. Mike Pennell has joined.
Hi, I'm Mike Pennell. I'm Associate Professor of Biostatistics at Ohio State. My research is in Bayesian nonparametric methods with applications in tox risk assessment.
Great. Dr. Isaac Pessa.
Good morning, Isaac Pessa, professor of toxicology, recently emeritus at UC Davis. And my specialty is neurotoxicology, in particular gene-environment interactions for sensitivity to neurotoxicants.
Okay, congratulations on your recent retirement. Dr. Gloria Post.
Good afternoon. I'm Gloria Post. I'm a research scientist in the Division of Science and Research at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. I'm a human health toxicologist. I'm a DABT, and I work a lot on human health risk assessment and development of health-based guidelines for environmental contaminants.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Chris States.
Hi, I'm Christopher States. I'm a professor of pharmacology and toxicology, distinguished university scholar, and director of the Center for Integrative Environmental Health Sciences at the University of Louisville School of Medicine. I've been researching arsenic toxicology for the past 25 years or so, and I've done a lot of work in DNA damage and repair as well.
Thank you. Dr. Danielle Wyckoff.
Hi, yes, Danielle Wyckoff. I'm with Tox Strategies. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer and a Principal Scientist here. We are a consulting firm of about 100 scientists that provide services to both the public and private sector. I'm a toxicologist and risk assessor, and my areas of focus have been in using systematic review for supporting risk assessment with emphasis on critical appraisal methods and application to health-based guidance values.
Okay, welcome. Thank you. And then last but not least, Dr. Carol Wood.
Hi, I'm Carol Wood. I am retired from Oak Ridge National Laboratory with work in just general human health risk assessment, emergency planning, emergency response.
Okay, great. So I'm really pleased with the panel members we have, so much expertise relevant to this assignment. So I'm just going to quickly review what is on our agenda, and then we'll hear from EPA. So we are here today at our first meeting. This is considered a preliminary meeting in advance of our 3-day meeting that will be held later this month in DC. And this is an opportunity for us to, first of all, meet each other as we just did, but hear from EPA in terms of the task that they have undertaken here with preparing this IRIS toxicological review of inorganic arsenic. So we'll hear from Dr. Chris Thayer and Dr. Samantha Jones initially, and then we'll have a presentation from Dr. Janice Lee and Dr. Alan Davis, who are the co-chemical managers and chemical pollutant assessment division. Then we'll have an opportunity for the panel to ask any clarifying questions that we might have. And just to reiterate what we heard earlier from Diana, that this isn't a meeting where we plan to deliberate, but rather just to have any clarification on what was presented to us. Then we'll have a short break, after which we'll have an opportunity for public comment, and we'll hear from our public speakers, which is a very important element of our activities, as we do want to get continued input from these speakers. Then after that, we'll review the charge questions in some detail and make sure that we have a complete understanding of them, and perhaps if there are any that need further clarification, or if we want to consider other elements, that's the opportunity to do that. Then we'll have a short recap and adjourn. And I think that is a pretty straightforward agenda that we have here. So with that, I'd like to then next turn over the baton to Dr. Samantha Jones, who's the Associate Director for Assessment Sciences at the Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment, and Dr. Chris Thayer, who's Division Director of Chemical and Pollutant Assessment Division, both within the Office of Research and Development at EPA. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Thorne. Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today. As Dr. Thorne just mentioned, I'm Samantha Jones. I'm here on behalf of EPA and ORD, the Office of Research and Development, in my role as the National Program Director for Health and Environmental Risk Assessment, or HERA, research program. And this is a program that plans for science assessments like the inorganic arsenic assessment that we're discussing today. Also, you might note from the agenda that I serve another role in ORD as the Associate Director for Assessment Science in the Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment. And this is the ORD center that houses the IRIS program. We are very excited to be at this peer review milestone in our process, and we're looking forward to today and the next meeting later in January. Let's go to the next slide. I wanted to really take the next few slides to provide some background and context for today. As most of you know, EPA is a regulatory agency, but ORD is the non-regulatory research arm of this agency, and we're responsible for providing the scientific foundation for EPA to execute its mandate to protect human health and the environment. We conduct the science that's rooted in the mission of the agency, and we're focused on delivering relevant, reliable, and transparent scientific information and products. Next slide. In short, ORD science informs decisions. ORD is the lead for one of EPA's cross-agency strategies, which is to ensure scientific integrity and science-based decision-making. As shown in the figure, ORD research here on the left feeds into risk assessment and risk management activities. And then we have feedback from those stages coming back to drive research. The research that we're discussing today is in the middle. We're talking about two pieces of risk assessment: hazard identification and dose response analysis. This work focuses on the science to inform, excuse me, but not set the policies or rulemakings. Those all come later. They're conducted by other parts of the agency, and they incorporate many other elements and pieces of information and have their own processes. So for today, our hazard ID and dose response products, we typically refer to them as science assessments, toxicity assessments. If the agent under investigation happens to be a chemical, we refer to them as chemical assessments. All of this differentiating them from a risk assessment, meaning that the inorganic arsenic assessment will feed into risk assessments that are done by other parts of the agency, but the IRIS assessment does not represent a risk assessment in and of itself. Next slide. So in general, science assessments are under the purview of ORD's HERA research program. Our program is designed to develop and apply state-of-the-science research to characterize stressor impacts on human and ecological systems. So for today, we're talking about a chemical stressor on humans. Our research program also aims to innovate and advance the science and practice of assessments. And we're responsible for developing a portfolio of fit-for-purpose assessment products and research to meet the needs and priorities of EPA and others. Ultimately, our goal is to characterize the science and conduct assessments that are in keeping with EPA's scientific integrity policy. Next slide. So when we consider science assessment development, we're focused on factors such as quality, transparency, consistency, and scientific defensibility. Shown here on the slide are several long-standing ORD products that support decisions across the agency, like the integrated science assessments that inform Office of Air and Radiation's development of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or the NAAQS, or the provisional peer-reviewed toxicity values that inform the Office of Land and Emergency Management's Superfund-related activities. And of course, the IRIS assessments like inorganic arsenic, which inform a wide variety of EPA offices and regions on both national and site-specific decisions. These are just a few of the products that we provide under HERA, and the multidisciplinary team you'll be hearing from today are also key team members for these and other diverse products, tools, models, and databases that we have. And we have a significant amount of integration across our scientists. Next slide. So to sum up, ORD conducts science to inform decision makers. For our part of ORD research, we strive to produce high quality, transparent, consistent, and scientifically defensible assessment products. We're working to ensure that the research is solutions focused and driven by priority needs. And we're developing all of this work in accordance with agency's policies, guidelines, and procedures, including those for scientific integrity and peer review. And on that last note, peer review is important, very important to EPA. And in this effort, we're looking to you all for your expertise, your experience. We're asking you to provide input on the assessment materials, the scientific conclusions drawn, and the rationale for those conclusions. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and attention and for serving in this important reviewer role. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Thayer. Chris.
Hi. Good afternoon, everybody, at least from the East Coast side. So again, I just want to sort of offer off my appreciation to Dr. Thorne and the panel members, SAB staff, certainly the assessment team, public commenters, and others who are joining. It's all really very critical to the IRIS process. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the IRIS program and our assessments. You can go to the next slide. I realize most people here are familiar with IRIS, but the Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS, is actually a database of health effects information on hundreds of environmental pollutants. As Samantha indicated, these IRIS assessments contribute to decisions across EPA and other health agencies. In the assessments, they provide toxicity values for cancer and non-cancer health effects. And again, just to sort of amplify, iris assessments have no direct regulatory impact until they're combined with information on exposure, cleanup cost, available technology, and other considerations in risk management that are really the purview of other EPA programs and regions, not ORD. Next slide. Several times a year, the IRIS program posts a program outlook 3 times a year, February, June, and October. It presents ongoing and planned IRIS assessments and related activities. It shows the public milestone and release dates. And what I'm showing here is a screenshot from the October 2023 program outlook. And you can see that in fiscal year 24, Q2, external peer review was indicated, and here we are. So today we're having the pre-review meeting, and then there will be a public meeting on January 24th to the 26th later this month. Next slide. Again, this has already been sort of indicated, but IRIS assessments contribute to agency decisions, including national health-based standards, cleanup levels at local sites, health-based advisory levels, ranking across chemicals, information to the general public, and then also cost-benefit analysis. In particular, IRIS supports a number of statutes implemented by EPA. In particular, if you've seen the protocol, it indicates some of the scoping needs. So particular drivers for this arsenic assessment, as indicated in the protocol, the Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Water Act, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA, and the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, or RCRA. Certainly, there would be other applications of this assessments, but those were really the drivers. Next slide. So again, this is kind of maybe a bit of a visual picture of what Samantha indicated. So in terms of the risk characterization and risk management process, IRIS really informs the first 2 steps. One would be hazard identification. I'm looking at the green boxes. In terms of qualitative, the nature of the hazardous effects, and then dose response assessment. So quantitative, the concentrations or doses associated with effect induction. And then this information gets used in combination with exposure assessment to help develop a risk characterization, and that feeds into risk management. So those bluish boxes are outside of the scope of the IRIS program and outside the scope of this assessment. I do want to just sort of comment on exposure assessment. In IRIS assessments, we will often provide some contextual information about exposure, but we do not consider IRIS assessments to be comprehensive exposure assessment documents. That's not their purpose. Again, conducting a comprehensive exposure assessment would be outside the purview of the IRIS program. Next slide. So EPA takes scientific integrity very seriously, and IRIS program produces state-of-the-science assessments that are objective, transparent, and rigorous. As I'll show you on the next slide, in terms of the IRIS process, I think they are perhaps one of the, if not the most extensively reviewed toxicity value assessments in the world. The IRIS program follows a very sort of structured and transparent process in developing the assessments, and it's done in accordance with EPA's peer review handbook, EPA scientific integrity policy, and the 7-step process, which I'll summarize in the next slide. So the 7-step process. Step 1, scoping and problem formulation, developing the draft. As you might imagine, it's the longest step. And recently, including for arsenic, that includes getting public comment on a protocol. In this case, that protocol not only had public comment, but also underwent a peer review by the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And then, we are in step 4. We are in the external peer review meeting portion. Prior to this step, we had step 2, which was agency review. And then step 3 was interagency science consultation. And then in October 2023, the draft assessment was released for public comment. And then again, today we're here kicking off the external peer review meeting. Following this meeting, we will, following getting the peer review report, we will revise the assessment, step 5. And then in step 6, we undergo a final round of agency review and interagency science discussion before finalizing the assessment. So we often get asked, how long is it going to take? And as you can imagine, steps 5 and 6 and 7 really hinge on seeing the nature of that peer review report. It's really hard to sort of anticipate the extent of revisions until you have that report in hand. I think right now I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to to Alan Davis and Janice Lee, the co-chemical managers. I know we have an opportunity to ask clarification questions. I'm not sure if we want to stop now between Samantha and I before we go into the actual content of the assessment, or just save them all till the end. You're on mute.
Yeah, thanks. I could ask just quickly if there's any clarifying questions before we hear from Janice, Dr. Lee. Okay, hearing none, why don't you go ahead? Thank you.
Okay, passing it off.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Hello, I'm Janice Lee, and I'm one of the assessment leads for the inorganic arsenic assessment. And I'll be presenting some background information, scoping and problem formulation decisions that were made, and give an overview of assessment methods related to systematic review and hazard identification. Then I'll pass it over to Alan Davis, the other assessment lead, who will cover the dose response related parts of the assessment. Next slide. So for this peer review, we have the toxicological review that includes hazard identification and dose response, appendices that contain supporting analyses and documentation, and then also charge questions. So the charge questions outline the scope for the review and helps ensure EPA gets feedback on key areas of scientific complexity. And all of these documents can be found on the assessment's website. Other materials that are available and may be useful are the updated problem formulation and protocol document that includes the revised scope and methods used in the development of the assessment. And this was first released in 2012. The current version is based on multiple engagements with the national academies and also the public. It was peer-reviewed by NASM in 2019, and you can find public comments submitted on the draft assessment in the docket. Next slide. So briefly, I'm going to give an overview of inorganic arsenic exposure for background purposes. But as Chris already noted, the IRIS program doesn't conduct exposure assessments, as it's not the purview, and it's the purview of other EPA offices. Next slide. So inorganic arsenic compounds come from both natural and anthropogenic sources. Inorganic arsenic is found naturally in soil, groundwater, and air, and it's widely used in several industrial processes. So it's used in the hardening of copper and lead alloys, glass manufacturing, electrical devices, semiconductors, production of ethylene oxide, textiles, preservation of hides, as well as medicinals, pesticides, and pigments. It was also used in wood preservation, but this was discontinued for residential structures in 2003. Next slide. Because arsenic is naturally occurring and used in several industrial processes, it can be found in the environment. The highest background levels are found in soils, where the concentrations range from 1 to 40 ppm. Food usually contains 20 to 140 parts per billion of total arsenic, but the amount of inorganic arsenic is usually much lower than that. Most waters contain less than 10 parts per billion, but there are certain areas in the Western US that have much higher levels, where there's been reports of 1,000 to 3,400 parts per billion observed. And the average drinking water concentration in the US is 2 parts per billion. And again, certain parts of the US have higher levels. The average concentration in ambient air ranges from 1 to 2,000 nanograms per meter cubed. Next slide. So next I'll go over scoping and problem formulation decisions that were made that guided development of the assessment. In 2019, the scope of the assessment was refined, and this was informed by prior engagements with NASM, EPA program and regional offices, and other stakeholders. Using systematic review and NRC's prioritization tiering, health outcomes with robust or moderate human evidence were prioritized for dose response analysis and toxicity value derivation. Outcomes that were prioritized in 2019 include the ones listed in this bullet, which are bladder cancer, lung cancer, skin cancer, diseases of the circulatory system, skin lesions, diabetes, pregnancy and birth outcomes, renal cancer, non-malignant respiratory disease, neurodevelopmental effects, immune effects, and liver cancer. More recently, in 2023, the scope was further refined to prioritize health outcomes. And this was based on hazard judgment, relative risk to background analysis, and the potential use for benefits cost analysis by the program offices. So now the current assessment focuses on bladder cancer, lung cancer, diseases of the circulatory system, diabetes, pregnancy and birth outcomes, and neurodevelopmental effects. And the other health outcomes that were prioritized in 2019 are no longer prioritized for dose response analyses. In addition, oral exposure was prioritized in 2023. Next slide. A decision was made to also focus on human data for dose response. And this is consistent with NRC's conclusion that human data are expected to be the basis for dose response analysis. By using human data, uncertainty related to species extrapolation and relevance can be avoided. And it also allows for observations in human variability. The decision to focus on human data is also consistent with recommendations in EPA guidelines, like the EPA cancer guidelines and other external reports on inorganic arsenic from the NRC and NESM that state human data is preferred over animal data when there are epidemiology studies of sufficient quality available. Next slide. A significant amount of work was done to look at the potential use of mode of action analysis to inform dose response. And this approach was supported during the 2019 NESM peer review of the protocol. And this is currently presented in Appendix A of the updated problem formulation and protocol document, which includes an analysis of mode of action common to multiple effects. In addition, there was also an analysis that was conducted using a case study on bladder cancer to look at the feasibility of using mode of action and mechanistic data to inform dose response. And what we found then is that the impact and utility on dose response analysis was minimal, especially when there are a number of epidemiology studies of low level exposure. Next slide. So our approach for mode of action adheres to EPA's cancer guidelines, which states that mode of action analyses can be used to address human relevance, human variability, and to inform dose response. So when we look at how this applies to arsenic, starting with human relevance, inorganic arsenic is a known carcinogen with a large amount of high quality epidemiology evidence. For human variability, there's also extensive information on risk modifiers and susceptibility in a number of epidemiology studies. And then finally, for dose response, there are epidemiology studies with low-level exposure to inorganic arsenic, which means that we don't need to extrapolate to low doses, and we can use existing low-dose data. Next slide. As I just mentioned, mode of action was fully considered and discussed in the protocol, and we also conducted a case study using bladder cancer. An observation we made based on that work is using mode of action for the inorganic arsenic assessment would introduce uncertainty. And this is because in vitro studies are conducted at higher concentrations In vitro model systems would have to be applied to humans. There's the question of, whether in vitro concentrations can be extrapolated to human exposure levels. And also there would be difficulty from extrapolating from rodent studies since humans are more sensitive to arsenic. And the majority of the 2019 NASEM committee agreed that mode of action information will not contribute directly to determining the shape of the dose response curve based on the epidemiology data. Next slide. This figure shows the availability of low dose data for the endpoints of interest. And here the x-axis corresponds to daily intake and the y-axis shows the odds ratio or relative risk. The green line in the figure is the estimated US background and the purple line is the US drinking water standard. So here the figure shows that there are low dose data available and therefore mode of action data is not needed to inform low dose extrapolation. Okay, next slide. Moving on to assessment methods. Next slide. Okay, systematic review methods used in the development of the draft assessment are described in the updated protocol, which I already mentioned is in Appendix A, and it's also in Chapter 1 of the toxicological review. The protocol describes the systematic review methods and approaches used for hazard identification and dose response. Notable changes that have been made since 2019 include refinements to the PICO statements or criteria. The PICO is short for populations, exposures, comparators, and outcomes. And this refinement was used to further prioritize outcomes, which I already mentioned. Other notable changes are methods for reference dose and cancer slope factor derivation are included. And there's also a protocol history section that has been included. And this protocol history section summarizes changes that have been made to the protocol since it was first released. And it also includes a summary of public comments received on the protocol. Next slide. Okay. So PICO criteria guides development of an assessment, and this table shows the current PICO criteria, which focuses the assessment on human studies of any population and life stage, subchronic or chronic exposures, oral exposures, and the health outcomes of interest are, again, bladder cancer, lung cancer, diseases of the circulatory system, diabetes, pregnancy and birth outcomes, and neurodevelopmental effects. Studies on PBPK models for inorganic arsenic were also considered PICO relevant. A similar table can be found in the protocol that shows how the PICO has evolved over time. Next slide. This slide summarizes the non-cancer and cancer health effects that were evaluated in the assessment. Non-cancer effects evaluated include effects on the circulatory system, pregnancy and birth outcomes, neurodevelopmental effects, and diabetes. And for cancer effects, we adopted a classification of human carcinogen for bladder cancer and lung cancer. So for these two outcomes, hazard identification was not revisited. And for cancer, the focus was on dose response analysis. Literature searches were conducted using PubMed, Web of Science, and ToxLine. Studies meeting PICO criteria moved on to study evaluation and data extraction. And non-PICO studies were categorized as potentially relevant supplemental materials. And this included epidemiology studies on other health outcomes that are not listed in the PICO, toxicology, mode of action mechanistic studies, meta-analyses, susceptibility, ADME, exposure assessment, and life stages. A total of 523 studies meeting PICO were identified, and title and abstracts for these studies can be found in the HERO database. Next slide. Literature search and screening results were also documented and can be visualized through a literature inventory tree, which can be found in HAWK, which stands for the Health Assessment Workspace Collaborative. And literature trees are interactive visuals where you can drill down to individual studies under the different tags. So in this example, we're showing a literature tree for diseases of the circulatory system. And it shows 94 studies that were evaluated as medium or high confidence, 29 that are low confidence or uninformative. And if you click on the medium or high confidence node, it then shows the number of studies by endpoint. And to further drill down, you can click on the endpoint and it will show you the number of studies by study design and the actual studies. Okay, next slide. After PICO relevant studies were identified, studies were then evaluated looking at potential bias and insensitivity. The domains evaluated include selection bias, confounding, performance bias, attrition, detection bias, selective reporting bias, and other threats to internal validity. An overall confidence rating was then assigned for each study based on expert judgment. And the ratings include high, medium, low, and uninformative. This heat map on the right is also from HAWK, and it's another example of how study evaluations are documented and presented. So each column represents a study, and the rows correspond to the domains. And at the bottom, this row shows the overall confidence rating. For more details, you can click on a cell to drill down to a domain-specific question and the rationale for the rating. Next slide. This figure shows how data is stored and visualized in HAWK after extraction. And the forest plots for individual results can be generated and are available to view and download in HAWK. Next slide. Evidence synthesis includes description, analysis, and presentation of human evidence to facilitate strength of evidence judgments. Considerations that inform judgments are study confidence ratings, consistency, effect magnitude and imprecision, dose response, directness of outcome measures, and coherence. Evidence synthesis conclusions from NRC and others were adopted for bladder cancer and lung cancer. And new evidence synthesis conclusions were developed for diseases of the circulatory system, pregnancy and birth outcomes, neurodevelopmental effects, and diabetes. The methods for evidence synthesis are described in the protocol and are consistent with the IRIS handbook. So this includes using a structured framework to draw human evidence synthesis judgments. And a human synthesis judgment of robust is for the strongest evidence, followed by moderate, slight, indeterminate, and compelling evidence of no effect. Robust and moderate categories are sufficient to identify hazard, while slight and indeterminate categories are insufficient to identify hazard without other supporting evidence. And for the inorganic arsenic assessment, robust leads to an evidence integration conclusion of evidence demonstrates, and moderate leads to a conclusion of evidence indicates. And now I'll pass it over to Alan Davis.
Thanks, Janice. My name is Alan Davis. I'm the co-assessment lead with Janice, primarily working on the dose response side of the assessment. with Jeff Gift, who was one of our lead modelers. So the analyses that are applied, the dose response analyses that are applied in the assessment are responsive to recommendations made by a number of NRC or NASEM committees over multiple separate reviews that were specific to arsenic in some cases and just general risk assessment reviews. The protocol was reviewed in 2019 by NASEM. And as the findings of that review, the panel agreed with EPA's modeling approach, including the use of the logistic model, and affirmed previous determinations by the 2013 critical aspects review of arsenic, including the prioritization of epi data and characterizing dose response relationships down to background concentrations. As part of the NRC review of the IRIS program in 2014, it recommended systematic use of uncertainty analyses and expanded uses of Bayesian methods, which are used in the current assessment. The 2013 review of the arsenic assessment recommended EPA consider all adequate epidemiology studies across an array of health effects. And so that led us to develop a meta-regression approach, derive risk-specific doses for analyses that would typically, where typically you would instead derive a reference dose. And so in the assessment, you'll see that we do provide a number of dose-specific risks, lifetime risks, but probabilistic approaches that are applied to both non-cancer and cancer data. So a harmonization of the modeling approaches used for cancer and non-cancer data. Consider all routes of exposure. And so in the assessment, you'll see that when we derive our daily intake value, we do consider multiple routes of exposure in the estimation of that daily intake value. And then consider nonlinear models and meta-analyses. And so we do use a dose response meta-analysis or meta-regression approach for modeling using the logistic model. And we do investigate the potential need for more flexible models, such as the fractional polynomial models or the double hill models, to drill down into try to answer the question, is the logistic model sufficiently flexible for the data that we're modeling? The 2009 Science and Decisions report recommended incorporating a unified approach to modeling cancer and non-cancer endpoints, which we've applied, probabilistic methods for assessing uncertainty. And then way back to the 1994 Science and Judgment document, it recommended presenting quantitative representation of uncertainty, and we've done that in the assessment. Next slide. The dose response methods used in this assessment are additionally responsive to extensive reviews that have gone on as part of our draft development and internal agency and interagency reviews. And so, a focus on, determination that focus on epidemiologic studies is appropriate. The necessity of using animal toxicology or mode of action data, especially in the context of the available epidemiologic data. Recommendations, we got recommendations that the assessment should provide more explanation on the dose response analyses, including a number of aspects of those analyses, including the choice of priors, confidence intervals, the background rates of diseases that we use. And we've attempted to do that. And I think it's important also to note that the applied dose response methods have been reviewed, multiple times. They were subject to an independent review by external subject matter experts, but also the methods are published in the open literature. So the Hovey 2020 paper goes over the margin of exposure like analysis that we did to screen endpoints. And then the two Allen 2020 papers detail the specific aspects of the meta-regression approach. And so, these methods have been reviewed as part of, the journal review as well. Next slide. So specific aspects of the dose response Bayesian meta-regression approach that we've used, again, described in the two Allen et al. 2020 papers, which themselves are based on other, published approaches, especially the Gustafson 2002 paper, but novel or unique aspects of this analysis. We use a probabilistic dose conversion approach to convert study-specific oral dose metrics that are reported within studies to a common estimate of daily intake in units of microgram per kilogram day. And whereas previous meta-analyses may have only focused on, say, drinking water concentrations, micrograms per liter, our approach allows us to use multiple different study-specific metrics and again, convert them into this common dose metric. And so we're casting a wider net and considering a larger set of studies for dose response. We are using the logistic model, which is a dichotomous model, which does need incidence data. And we convert the odds ratios and relative risks from the individual studies into effective counts. So the incidence data that the logistic model needs, but we do it in such a way that we retain the control for confounding that was done in the individual studies. We use a multiple study hierarchical Bayesian dose response analysis, again with the logistic model. We use life table analyses to estimate lifetime risks at any microgram per kilogram day dose. We've provided a series of lifetime risks at a number of doses or these intake values, but we do provide the spreadsheets and the capability for end users to calculate a lifetime risk at any intake value that they may be interested in. All of our lifetime risks are presented from a hypothetical zero dose. Next slide, please. I've said this a few times now, but we do use the logistic model, on a justification that it's flexible enough to represent nonlinear dose response relationships that allow for the existence of multiple modes of action that are operant at different doses. And this is consistent with a number of previous NRC documents and reviews. And the use of the logistic model was supported by the 2019 NASEM review of the protocol. But we have conducted a number of sensitivity analyses with more complex models to interrogate this issue and provide stronger justification that the logistic model is flexible enough. And as part of these sensitivity analyses, we didn't see any, no model predicted decreasing risk with increasing dose in the low dose range. So no J-shaped dose response curves. And then more complex models, the fractional polynomial or the double hill models, were not statistically warranted based on AIC over the simpler logistic model. So using a process that's similar to how we, when we conduct benchmark dose modeling of animal tox data, where we apply multiple models to the data and then use AIC to select the most parsimonious model. We followed an approach similar to that and confirmed that the logistic model is appropriate for the data that we're modeling. Next slide. When we conducted the hierarchical modeling. We use the normal distribution for individual beta mean estimates. So the beta parameter of the logistic model, the slope, we use the normal distribution, which does allow for negative values, but we used a gamma distribution that does not allow for negative values for when we estimated the pooled estimate of the slope. So, you know, the slope parameter over all the studies used in the meta-regression. And that reflects the determination that arsenic is causal for the health effects modeled in the assessment. So bladder cancer, lung cancer, diseases of the circulatory system, and diabetes, the endpoints that we used this meta-regression approach for, all had a causal hazard identification determination. So here, this is a consistency in the HI portion of the assessment and the dose response portion. And it's important to note also that the gamma distribution puts most of the prior weight on smaller slope values that are closer to zero. And that means you need sufficiently strong dose response data to estimate larger posterior slope values. And so that characteristic of the gamma distribution increases confidence that this is really a data-driven modeling approach, and in the outputs that we obtain modeling the individual or all the studies for the distinct health endpoints are data-driven. It's not that the prior is overwhelming the modeling. It's the dose response data that we're using that is having the most impact on the outputs. Next slide. Here we just have a graphical representation of the modeling results where you see the individual, the distribution, the posterior distributions for the individual, the posterior distribution for the logistic slope for the individual studies, but also the posterior slope for the pooled estimate across all the studies. These pooled slope estimates is what was used in the life table analyses to obtain estimates of lifetime extra risk above zero for, again, bladder cancer, lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, and ischemic heart disease incidence in diabetes. Next slide. Okay, so those were the methods, and now we're going to move into the actual output of the modeling in the modeling findings. Next slide. Yeah, okay. It's important to note that while there was a screening of studies for PICO and HI purposes, there was an additional systematic review and screening of studies to select studies that were appropriate for dose response. This process is described in the protocol. Only high and medium confidence studies that met the PICO criteria were considered for dose response. There was a primary screening that focused on information and characteristics that were necessary for our modeling approach. So, for example, was a study a case control or a cohort study? Cross-sectional studies, eco studies weren't appropriate for our modeling, so we would screen those out at this stage. Were quantitative risk metrics reported? Were the number of cases in control per dose group reported? So characteristics like that. And so the studies that then got through this primary screening then underwent a secondary screening focused on characteristics that we thought were important for extrapolation of risks to human population. So selection of low exposure studies versus very high exposure studies, the selection of incident studies for most of the endpoints. Mortality studies were deemed appropriate for lung cancer, just given the mortality lung cancer. So, the secondary screening to select the final set of studies to model for the individual endpoints. Next slide. This is a representation of the modeling results for bladder cancer. Bladder cancer was determined to be carcinogenic to humans. We modeled 11 data sets from 11 epidemiologic studies across diverse populations, United States populations, Italian, Taiwanese. And as you can see in the table here, across a range of inorganic arsenic daily doses, we then calculate the mean, the 5th and 95th percentile for the lifetime extra risk. We graph those lifetime risks, and looking at the low dose portion of this graph, we see that the lifetime risks are approximately linear, and then we derive the lifetime cancer slope factor from this low dose portion of the graph. We do provide a nonlinear or polynomial equation for the across the entire range of intake values. So if someone needs to estimate, if someone is looking at very high exposures, they can use the approximate polynomial equations. But in the low dose region, we're looking at an approximately linear relationship that is equivalent to lung cancer. Oh, oops. Good catch. I apologize about that. So that's my bad. But the point remains is that we calculate the cancer slope factor the same way for bladder cancer and lung cancer. Next slide. And so here, the graphs here are for bladder cancer. So I apologize for mixing that up. For lung cancer, again, it's determined to be carcinogenic to humans. For lung cancer, we had 8 epi studies and 10 data sets from those studies, again, in diverse populations. We calculate the lifetime extra risk across a range of doses the same way. We provide a graph for the entire dose range, but also the low dose region, where we see that the relationship is linear, and we base our cancer slope factor for lung cancer on the slope of that lifetime extra risk to dose relationship in the low dose range. Next slide. What are the symbols and the lines in the graph? Can you go back? Sorry. The filled dots are the lifetime extra risk. So the dashed line is the central tendency, so the mean, and then the solid line is the 95th percentile for the extra risk. And then that's what we base the cancer slope factor on. For the cancer dose response analysis and the non-cancer dose response analysis for CVD incidence and IHD incidence and diabetes. And again, we use the same modeling approach for these 2 cancer endpoints and those 3 non-cancer endpoints. And so a harmonization of modeling approaches there. We do recognize that there are a number of modeling assumptions that go into the analysis. And so we do present a number of sensitivity analyses to investigate potential sources of uncertainty in the modeling methodology. And these include uncertainty in the dose conversion methodology. If you drill down into how we do that, we we generate 3 separate dose estimates based on profile likelihood. So a best estimate of what the dose conversion is, and then a high and a low. We do a leave one out analysis to look at the choice of study and how that impacts the modeling outputs. We look at alternative gamma distributions, either wider or more narrow prior distributions, to see how that impacts modeling results. The use of urine biomarker studies. So if we take out all the urine biomarker studies, what do the results look like? The use of lagged risk estimates or alternative dose metrics, if those are available in the studies that we use in the modeling. And then consideration of inhalation when calculating the total inorganic arsenic background exposure. So, and these again are above and beyond the sensitivity analyses that we conducted on using more complex dose response models in lieu of the logistic model. Next slide. So ultimately, we do provide a cancer slope factor for bladder cancer alone, lung cancer alone, but then the final cancer slope factor that we present in the assessment is the combined cancer risk of developing bladder cancer or lung cancer. And this is consistent with approaches that have been used in previous IRIS assessments. Next slide. So for non-cancer health effects, next slide. A determination of evidence demonstrates that arsenic causes diseases of the circulatory system and diabetes was made based on robust evidence in humans. And then a determination of evidence indicates that arsenic is likely to cause pregnancy outcomes and neurodevelopmental effects in humans is based on moderate evidence, as Janice previously described. Next slide. Diseases of the circulatory system and diabetes were, again, modeled using the Bayesian meta-regression approach for CVD incidence. We had 2 studies for ischemic heart disease incidence. There were 4 studies used, and then 4 studies used for diabetes. For pregnancy outcomes, we used an approach where we didn't have any studies that were that had an external dose metric presented. There were a number of pregnancy outcome studies that were either urine biomarker studies or cord blood studies, but the PBPK model that we had is not parameterized for pregnant women, and we weren't confident in using it to convert those biomarkers into a daily intake. And so we were really restricted to studies that had an external dose metric and drinking water concentration. And so there was a single study, Kyle 2016, that looked at birth weight and drinking water concentrations, and they presented a beta coefficient that we then used in order to calculate a BMD and a BMDL. So we do use a different method for deriving the BMD and BMDL and ultimately the candidate value for birth weight compared to diseases of the circulatory system and diabetes. And the neurodevelopmental effects were considered for modeling, but ultimately were not advanced into point of departure derivation, primarily due to non-monotonicity in the exposure response relationship in the critical study, which was the Wasserman et al. 2014 study. So unfortunately, we didn't generate a candidate value for neurodevelopmental effects. Next slide. So we do, for the non-cancer effects, it's important to step back away from this slide for a second and say, for DCS and diabetes, we're not showing it here, but in the assessment, you'll see that we present the results of the Bayesian meta-regression the same way for DCS endpoints in diabetes. So, a table of lifetime extra risks at a number of doses. We provide the graphs and the approximate equations for the slopes of those extra risks. So we do provide, probabilistic dose response modeling results for these non-cancer endpoints. But in order to meet the needs of our program offices and regional offices, we additionally derive a traditional reference dose or candidate values, and then ultimately a single reference dose for non-cancer effects. So for non-cancer endpoints in the assessment, you will see probabilistic modeling results, but also this traditional reference dose approach as well. For DCS and diabetes, the candidate values are based on BNDL-05, so extra risk of 5%, and that's derived from the 95th percentile upper bound on the meta-regression logistic slopes. For pregnancy outcomes, the candidate value is again based on a BNDL-05, derived from the 95th percentile upper bound on the study reported linear regression coefficient. So we generate a point of departure for all 4 non-cancer endpoints. We apply a composite uncertainty factor of 3 for all points of departure. And this composite uncertainty factor of 3 is entirely composed of a residual human inter-individual variability uncertainty factor of 3. And then ultimately, we select the RFD of 0.031 micrograms per kilogram day based on CVD incidence. Next slide. Final thoughts for the assessment is that, the methods applied in the IRIS toxicological review are rigorous and transparent. We fully implemented systematic review methodologies for the identification, evaluation, and synthesis of epidemiologic data. We use a Bayesian meta-regression life table approach. That includes probabilistic approaches for converting multiple study-reported dose metrics into daily intake metric. It uses multiple cohort and case control studies in the meta-regression. And we generate dose at a risk values for bladder cancer, lung cancer, CVD, IHD, and diabetes, as well as risk at a dose values. And then ultimately, in addition to that, we derive an oral reference values for the non-cancer effects and cancer slope factors for the cancer effects. And, I guess most notable or very notable is the updated inorganic arsenic toxicological review includes non-cancer effects that are more sensitive than cancer. And so, that's diseases of the circulatory system seem to be the driver of the assessment. And with that, next slide. I won't go through all these names, but this is a very extensive list of people that were critical in the development of the assessment, the review of the assessment, the production, contract support. So it takes a village, and it took a big one here. So and I think that might be it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Davis. And thank you also, Dr. Lee. Anything from your team before we proceed? Okay, so this is the point at which we have the panel ask any clarifying questions, non-deliberative sort of clarifying questions about the presentation or the document. I open it up to the panel. Yeah, go ahead, Gloria. Dr. Post.
I had a question about the very last bullet point on the last slide before the acknowledgements about the conclusion that the non-cancer effects are more sensitive than the cancer effects. I figured I calculated the dose for different risk levels, like between 10 to the -4 and 10 to the -6, based on the slope factor. And it was, unless I made an error, but I checked a few times, it was lower than the reference dose. So I was wondering what the basis of that conclusion is.
So if you look at the probabilistic, if you look at the lifetime risks for CVD incidents, say, at a dose in those tables where we present the lifetime extra risks across the doses, and compare that to the lifetime risks for lung cancer or bladder cancer, they are higher.
Okay, so it's not, I didn't delve into the document yet. I was reviewing the PowerPoint that was just presented. So what you just mentioned isn't included in the PowerPoint, right?
No, ma'am, it was not.
Oh, okay, thanks. Oh.
Okay, and then just to make sure everyone's clear, when you were presenting on the lung cancer and bladder cancer, it's just that the graphs that were included on those slides were swapped, right?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. Otherwise, the information there was all correct.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, just want to make sure that we had that clear to everyone. Other questions from the panel?
This is Hugh Barton. I guess I assume folks from EPA will be available at our meeting at the end. I have some questions, but I'm not sure they're clarifying questions.
Okay.
So I don't want to ask them now if it's more appropriate to wait till our January meeting.
Okay. Without knowing what they are, I can't help you decide that. But yes, there will be EPA people there at our in-person meeting in Washington.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Danielle Wyckoff.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, Hugh asked one of the questions I had, so that's good. But I do have just a couple of what I think are clarifying. First, was a formal uncertainty assessment conducted?
Meaning?
So you talked a little bit about some sensitivity analyses, but kind of a full evaluation of the sensitivity or uncertainty of various inputs on the overall. So it's standard part of risk assessment and it's an uncertainty assessment.
So, I mean, it's a piecemeal uncertainty assessment where we, again, looked at how the modeling results change when we look at different modeling assumptions. But
okay. And then I also wondered, so there was a lot of information about assessing model fit relative to what I would kind of call the math, but I was wondering if there were exercises conducted to assess a model fit relative to the biology. So maybe looking at earlier cellular organ level effects. So similar to some of the things you might look at in a mode of action, but do you see the same dose response type of relationships for earlier events?
no.
Okay.
We only modeled the risk values for the apical diseases that were reported in the individual studies.
Okay, but there was no kind of going back to look at even qualitatively to go look at kind of a proof of concept or validation of those model fits based on the biological data?
No.
Okay. And then I guess, sorry, I have one last question, and I think maybe this is for Janice. I was wondering if you could clarify how causality was assessed in determining the human synthesis judgments.
Oh, I was just getting off of mute. So for causality, for the assessment I mentioned, when the human synthesis judgment was robust, that would lead to the evidence integration conclusion of evidence demonstrates, and then moderate led to the conclusion of evidence indicates. And the synthesis judgments were based looking at the study evaluations and confidence for the individual studies, but then also looking at the other factors that I talked about.
Okay, so these, but I guess what I was wondering is, so these are largely observational data, is that correct?
Yes, these are epidemiology studies. Mm-hmm.
Yep, which are often used more for association versus causation. So I was curious if you could just speak to the if there was a formal assessment process for looking at causality, like Bradford Hill.
The Bradford Hill considerations were part of it. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else, Dr. Wyckoff?
That's it for now. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Pennell.
Hi, thanks. So I have a couple questions to Alan about the Bayesian analyses. First one is on some of the results presented. First one is on slide 41. You present some posteriors, and I tried to zoom in to figure out what it was, but there's the upper left-hand plot. Could you explain exactly what that parameter is?
Yep, sorry, getting off mute. Yeah, the upper left hand posterior distribution, that is the pooled logistic slope for over all the studies included in the meta-regression. All the other distributions are the study specific logistic slopes.
So that's the one, it had a gamma priors, right? So it had this positivity constraint was put upon it. Is that why the posterior is like, it's chopped off there?
Yes.
Okay. Did you consider, because again, it looks like the posterior is not necessarily agreeing with that sort of restriction. Did you consider a sensitivity analysis where you removed a positivity restriction?
No, we did not do a sensitivity analysis investigating like an alternative distribution for the pooled slope.
And then my other question, couple questions also on slide 51, has to do with your BMDL equation. If you can explain exactly what the components are in that, it was not clear to me. And then I'll let you do that first. Then I have kind of a follow-up question about your use of that equation for the BMDL.
Yeah, Jeff, are you on? Jeff Gift?
I see he's on. Not unmuting though.
Not unmuting. He might not be.
Jeff, you're muted.
Kirk, can you unmute Jeff?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
yes,
we can hear you. Thank you.
I'm sorry. I had to unmute my
computer as well as my phone. Okay, so this is the okay. This is the equation we use for getting the BMDL extrapolating down to zero.
Yes, the equation we used to get the BMDL based on the odds at PD and P0.
Yeah. So,
and what does that mean? Like odds at PD, like odds at a probability at corresponding to 5% and 0% extra risk. I guess that kind of confuses me. First off, that notation.
Yeah, this is an equation for extrapolating we have the odds at the PD from our life table analyses, and then we get the odds at PD 0 also from our life table analyses. We can get into the more detail about this next time. I'm really not prepared to talk about it right now.
Okay, yeah, it just doesn't. I don't understand what it mean. You're meaning like what you mean here by the odds at probability associated, because that's a little. That's
as far as explaining statistical terms. Alan and I don't claim to be statisticians. Both of us are toxicologists, and we rely for the statistical terminology and explanations on our staff. Bruce Allen is our primary statistician, and he'd be able to do a better job than me at explaining that.
okay. And I don't know if you can answer this one then. So it looks like you're using this kind of a single equation here to get a BMDL. When you're performing this Bayesian analysis, where it seems like you could actually use the samples from your Markov chain Monte Carlo to get an interval estimate for you. So that do you understand what I'm getting at? That I didn't understand how it doesn't seem congruent with the Bayesian analysis that was performed.
Right. So, and that goes back to we in an earlier internal draft we did derive a we derived non-cancer values based on the probabilistic approach, but we and that's still you can still do that with the results that we present in the assessment, but agency stakeholders really informed us that they needed an RFD, something that, so we derived our candidate values and selected the RFD using this approach. So there are probabilistic results and analyses, but also this more, I guess, non-probabilistic RFD presented. I was trying to find the spreadsheet where we do all our BMD calculations, Mike, just to try to on the fly refamiliarize ourselves exactly how we derived the BMDLs for the endpoints. And we, given our background dose and the probability at that background dose, we use the logistic slope to calculate a probability at our baseline dose, which is P0, and then the probability at the PD. So what the probability of response would be at our exposure dose PD. We calculate the odds at PO and the odds at PD, and then derive a BMD, BMDU, and BMDL based on that ratio of odds. So it's described in the assessment further. If it's not described adequately, that's of course something that we would need to address in the final draft to make sure that it's clear how we derive the BMDLs.
Yeah, and it's easier to understand, I think, maybe looking at the life table spreadsheets, which are now available through our science inventory.
So it's a ratio of odds of disease at those particular doses.
Yes.
Responders. Okay, that makes more sense. All right, thank you.
Okay. For that, other questions from the panel for our presenters? Yes, Dr. Barton.
So there was mention of the analyses with alternative models, the logistic and the other models. Where in the document would I find that to review that?
Jeff, the sensitivity analyses for the fractional polynomial and double hill model, is that Appendix C?
That's in Appendix Section C.1.2.
Okay, Appendix C.1.2. Thank you. Dr.
I believe that's right.
Dr. Chen.
So looks to me that the number of studies for pregnancy and birth outcomes and neurodevelopment was like only one study actually put into potential consideration of the dose response. That number seems like too low to me. There's literature, I guess there are more. I did not really do the research, but I believe there are more studies there. So what are the rationale to do the final selection of the studies actually on those outcomes? And is there any like termination date in terms of like selecting all the literatures?
Well, we used a study selection process to look at all the neurodevelopmental studies that we had, and that led us ultimately to consider the two Wasserman studies. The Bangladeshi study, I think it was 2004, and then the main study from 2014. And then we focused primarily on the main study, given it was conducted in a US population versus the Bangladeshi study. And so we identified the Wasserman 2014 study as the critical study, but then ultimately the outputs of that study led us to determine that it wasn't sufficient to support point of departure derivation. But the study selection approach is detailed in the relevant section in the dose response chapter.
Thanks.
If I may just follow up on that. So the notion of not including the Bangladesh study is that perhaps there's confounding that would make it less relevant to the US population, but was there specific things about that study that were used as justification for disqualifying it?
I think it's more accurate to say that we had a Bangladeshi study and we had a United States study, and then there would be less uncertainty in deriving a value based on a US population, since we are interested in extrapolation of risks to U.S. populations. So we affirmatively selected the U.S. study versus discounting the Bangladeshi study.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Dr. Chen, were you done? Yeah, okay. Yeah, Dr. Wei Chung Cha.
Hello. I have noticed you derived the cancer stall factor for bladder and lung cancer, and finally the US EPA used the combined stall factors. So typically from the conservative way, we always use the lowest value. I don't know why US EPA used the combined one, because the different cancer have a different mode of action. So if you use the combined one, they seems like I don't know why you use this value. And second question is, I noticed you say you use the PBK model to convert the dose for the derivation of neurotoxicity or developmental neurotoxicity, right? So did you use the pregnancy PBK model or general PBK model? Thank you.
So to the first question, there's quite a bit of evidence, and the NRC has touched on this in some of their reports, and then there's been publications that if you use an approach to, if you use the lowest cancer slope value, when you model multiple tumors, that actually is an underestimate of the composite risk. If you're looking at the risk of only the most sensitive tumor type and discount the risk of developing other tumor types, that is that's an underestimate of risk, or that would represent an underestimate of risk. And so there have been multiple quantitative approaches used in previous IRIS assessments. For animal tox data, we have a multi-tumor model that you can model multiple tumors together, and it outputs the composite risk.
Sorry, I apologize. So I modify my statement. I say the most sensitive value. So for in the cancer factor case, we should get the higher values. So yeah, I know Ellen's the explanation. Sorry, a misunderstanding. I mean, we need to use for conservative way. We need to use the most sensitive the value. In the cancer stall factor case, we need to use the higher values. Yeah.
Is there a response to that? Clarification?
Yes, higher values would be more conservative. I think we might have lost Alan.
Okay.
You're correct.
Could you repeat the question again, though?
The first question or the second question?
I think that Alan already answered the first question. My second question is, for the for the neurodevelopmental toxicity, you said you use the PBK model to convert the dose. So did you use the pregnancy PBK model or the general PBK model in this report?
Oh, we used a published PBK model developed by EPA scientists, and I believe Janice is most familiar with the crew that developed that PBK model. But yeah, that's an EPA published model.
Yeah, my point is, if you don't use the pregnancy PBK model to convert the dose measure in the maternal or fetus, there will have some uncertainty.
So this is Hugh Barton. I believe the statement was that they did not convert urine measurements for the pregnancy situation for the developmental endpoints because there isn't a pregnancy PBPK model. The one that they're using is essentially for adults, non-pregnant. So
Yeah.
I believe the
That's right.
statement was they did not do that conversion for the developmental outcomes.
That's right.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Alan. I'm sorry I got booted, but it sounds like the question got answered in my absence.
Okay, yeah, I think so. Thank you. I thought I saw Dr. Isaac Pesa's hand up.
I think partly answered with the discussion that just occurred, but I do have the only place that you account for susceptibility to the cardiovascular effects where there's a huge amount of data known about genetic polymorphisms or expressed mutations that contribute to susceptibility. The only place you account for that is the uncertainty factor. Is that correct? It's not part of the model. Is that
That's correct?
That's right.
So that would be over the distribution of threefold difference, potentially.
Right. So
Yeah.
go ahead, Jeff. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that for the CVD incidence, maybe not so much as for the other studies, but we used a broad spectrum of populations. We just used 2 studies for CVD incidence, but for the IHC incidence, we used 4 studies. So there's the thought is that the sensitive subpopulations will be represented, but not explicitly. And so in addition to the uncertainty factors, there's also the fact that the sensitive subpopulation was included in the meta populations that were analyzed.
Understood. Thanks.
I think it's important to note that the CVD and IHD studies were conducted in sensitive subpopulations. So we, as well as the pregnancy outcome, the birth weight study, we determined that or judged that the Bangladeshi study, that population was a sensitive subpopulation, and so we thought that, or we concluded that since we were using these studies of sensitive subpopulations, it warranted dropping down from the default tenfold inter-individual variability uncertainty factor, but it didn't warrant dropping all the way down to 1 that would reflect no uncertainty in that value. So
yeah,
thank you.
Sensitive in the sense that for instance, the Moon study evaluated the Native Indian population, which was represented by a high level of diabetics, but not in the sense that you were talking about earlier about polymorphisms. So we didn't have that kind of study to be able to hone in.
Okay. Thank you for that. Those questions and answers. Anybody else on the panel have a question for the EPA team? Alan Davis, I saw your mic light up.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's just me being noisy.
Okay, no worries. All right, last call here for panelists to have follow-up questions. Okay, well, I'm sure as we dive more deeply into this, we'll have things that will come up and in advance of our next meeting. So thank you. So Diana, I think we are a little bit ahead of schedule here. We are scheduled for a break at 2:10 Eastern time, and it's ahead of that. So I think we could go ahead and take a break right now and convene at 5 past the hour, and then we'll have opportunity for our public commenters. Is that an agreement with you, Diana?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, so everybody, we'll see you back here at 5 past the hour, and you can keep connected. Just mute yourself. So 5 past the hour. Okay, it is 5 past the hour, and it is time for us to end the break and move to the next agenda item. And next on our agenda, we have the opportunity to hear from public commenters. We have 3 speakers who registered to provide comments for the meeting today. And they are each allocated 3 minutes time to present their remarks. And I'll be keeping time, and I'll let each of them know when there's 2.5 minutes of their 3 minutes has elapsed. So first we have Dr. Samuel Cohen, who's a professor at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, speaking on his own behalf. So, Dr. Cohen? Dr. Cohen. I see that he is showing up on my screen. Okay. Last call, Dr. Cohen. All right. Dr. Goldberg, are you available to go?
Goldberg is here.
Okay. So
I'm not a doctor, but that's okay.
Okay, well, what I have here says so. So you've been elevated. Mr. Goldberg is with the Arsenic Science Task Force, which he chairs. So please go ahead with your comments.
Thank you, Dr. Wang, Dr. Thorne, members of the panel. As Dr. Thorne has pointed out, I chair the Arsenic Science Task Force, which is composed of organizations committed to ensuring sound science is applied in regulatory reviews of inorganic arsenic. For this initial meeting, ASTF has submitted a short letter which has been posted to the SAB website and which we urge you to review. I speak today to call your attention to the 3 principal points in our letter. First, we'd like to emphasize that this panel has a uniquely important role to play in reviewing the draft assessment. As EPA has made clear in its presentation, the draft before you has been well over 10 years in preparation. Yet EPA has allowed only a 60-day comment period and would not allow any extension. And EPA's BMD analysis material was only made available on December 29th, and then for only a 2-week comment period. In view of EPA's very limited allowance for public input, the role of this panel is particularly important. You, as panel members, represent the only opportunity for independent scientific views to be brought to bear on the inorganic arsenic assessment. ASTF urges this panel to thoughtfully and comprehensively review the IRIS program's work and provide a thorough, independent peer review. Second, our letter points out that this panel is fully authorized to go beyond the specific charge questions posed by the IRIS program. The IRIS handbook makes clear that EPA's questions are a guide, not a limitation. It further makes clear that information from EPA and the public should be fully considered. EPA's views are not entitled to any greater weight. Rather, information from EPA as well as from the public should be fully considered as part of your deliberations. Finally, and most importantly, our letter sets forth 3 questions the panel should address. These questions go beyond the specifics of the charge questions framed by EPA and will contribute to a more comprehensive review. They are: 1, consideration of mode of action information to inform the shape of the dose-response relationships of inorganic arsenic, and specifically low-dose arsenic effects. Second, EPA's use of information from epidemiology studies of populations that are subject to high exposures
30 seconds.
To make conclusions on possible effects caused by low exposures. And finally, EPA's use of a modeling approach based on statistical methods that are unvalidated or methods that dictate the shape of the dose-response relationships, irrespective of the data. Once again, ASTF urges you to review our letter, which includes examples of recent SAB and HSRB independent review panels that asked EPA to revise its approach. Thank you very much for your service on the panel and for conducting a thorough, independent review of EPA's work.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for both your oral comments and your written comments, which have been distributed to all the panel members and are, as you say, are posted. Okay. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Norman Forsberg, and you're with Simplot. So you have 3 minutes, sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you to the SAB for providing me the opportunity to speak today. My name is Dr. Norman Forsberg. I'm a principal toxicologist and risk assessor at Arcadis, a consulting and engineering firm, and I'm presenting on behalf of the JR Simplot Company. I'll be sharing a few key points from our review of the draft Inorganic Arsenic Toxicology Review. So we'd like to start by commending EPA for exploring innovative data analysis methods to analyze inorganic arsenic's epidemiological information. However, during the course of our review, we found that the combination of methods that EPA used was novel, beyond the scope of their existing dose response guidance and their publicly available modeling tools. EPA did not provide access to their supporting calculation files, nor clearly report which files they used to reach specific conclusions for today's public commenting meeting. For these reasons, the 60-day comment period simply did not provide us sufficient time or resources to be able to do a more detailed review. That said, the combination of these factors makes it critical that the SAB be provided all information that EPA generated and relied on, and sufficient time to conduct that critical review. At a technical level, we found that EPA broke from its longstanding guidance regarding mode of action. The mode of action analysis is essential to an assessment of inorganic arsenic, given the peer-reviewed evidence that supports threshold mechanisms at lower doses. The mode of action and underlying biology must be evaluated to reach defensible conclusions about the shape of cancer dose response curves at doses relevant for the US. Otherwise, the dose response assessment is simply an exercise in model fitting. The second point concerns the general use of a life table approach. EPA used a median intake, but should have used a mean intake to match its use of mean disease rates so as not to generate indefensibly biased toxicity factors. This would be similar to what was done in the publication by Allen et al. 2020, which EPA cited frequently. Thirdly, EPA did not address why their extra lifetime risk graphs, the ones we saw earlier, why they show a non-zero extra risk at their assumed background inorganic arsenic intake rate. This contradicts with the graphs that are presented in their peer-reviewed publication by Allen et al. It was confusing. There are also issues related to the implementation of the toxicity factors. For instance, the life table approach treats background inorganic arsenic intake and disease statistics as constants. However, we know that background intake rates and rates of disease vary across the US. Unfortunately, EPA is silent on if or how toxicity values derived using the life table approach would be handled when assessing site-specific risks in places with naturally higher background intake rates. The draft toxicity factors, if used in the same manner as those for other substances, would predict risk from background exposures that far exceed those currently considered acceptable by EPA. In some portions of the country, the exceedances are likely to be alarmingly high, like approaching excess lifetime cancer risks of 1 in 10 due to naturally occurring background exposures. The consequences of these decisions can't be understated, and we look forward to SAB's careful consideration of our comments and IRIS's assessment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Forsberg. And I'll just ask if Dr. Cohen is with us yet.
He's having trouble unmuting.
Oh yes, I see that. Thank you for pointing that out in the chat.
Yeah, perhaps you can ask him to disconnect and reconnect. That worked for the other gentleman.
So, yes, perhaps Dr. Cohen, if you heard that, if you can disconnect and reconnect, we'll give you another chance to hop in here. Yeah, apparently he's doing that. Well, while we're waiting to hear from him, are there any clarifying questions from the panel for either Mr. Goldberg or Dr. Forsberg?
Hi, this is Matt Gribble. I had a clarifying question on the previous remark.
Sure,
I didn't understand why using a median as an input was inconsistent with using a mean as an output for a model. Like those are separate things, unless I misunderstood the point.
Hi, this is Dr. Forsberg. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear
you. Excellent. So what we ended up doing was taking a look at what would happen if you used median disease statistics and median intake rates in the way that you would typically use inputs for doing a cancer risk assessment. We provided detailed comments in the comments that we uploaded to the project document or the assessment document that show when you use medians as the basis for intake rates that you end up not being able to calculate the typical levels of excess lifetime cancer risks that one would get when in practice for risk assessors. We have to use averages. And all the methods and our calculations are shown in that detailed document. And so I'd focus your attention there.
Thank you for clarifying.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Dr. Wyckoff.
Yeah, just a quick clarifying question. Did you say that you do or do not have the information to reproduce calculations?
It is correct that during the course of the review, we did not have the underlying files in order to be able to go in and actually check calculations that were done. Subsequent to the closing of the public 60-day period, those files were made available, and I think that they're currently going through their own period of public commenting. But in order to prepare today's comments, we didn't have them.
I see. Thank you.
Yep.
So I'll just remind you that there will be a public comment period as well at our in-person meeting in Washington, and you would be most welcome to sign up to present there. So I have just a question for Dr. Goldberg. I understand that in February of 2020, that ASTF 13 members met with 21 EPA folks, and yet you're suggesting that you haven't had sufficient engagement with the process. Can you speak to that?
Yes, of course. We have met with EPA multiple times during the development of the current draft, and we did meet with EPA in 2020. At the time, we had a general discussion about many of the issues that we're talking about here, mode of action and how it could be considered. And we didn't know what the draft would contain until we saw the published version that was released in October for a 60-day comment period. Yes, we were generally familiar with the issues, but we were not able to do as comprehensive a job as we would have liked in preparing and providing comments to EPA because of the short comment period. And as Dr. Boasberg pointed out, we couldn't, nor could our consultants, duplicate the calculations because critical aspects of the background material were not available at the time the current draft was released for public comment.
Thank you.
I hope that's helpful.
It is. Thank you very much for clarifying that. Let's see if we've got Dr. Cohen yet. I see from the chat that he's trying to call in. So Dr. Wong, would you like to suggest a way to proceed?
That's the wrong number to call in.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a way to get a little message to him. We can give him the right number.
He has the right number because in the file for the link, there's also a phone number under it, and that is a number he should be calling. So maybe I can send him an email right now.
Okay. Well, I would just say that if we're unable to hear
You can
from
see
him,
your chats. You could do it that way faster.
yeah, he did supply written comment to us, and we have that in our files. And it looks like it's a script for what he had intended to say. So I think at the very least we have his written comment. I'm appreciative of that. So it's great that he sent that in advance to us, and that Dr. Wong provided that to the panel. Well, I think we'll proceed then, and if he's able to join, we would entertain hearing from him, but I don't want to wait longer for him. So let's move to the next agenda item, which is the review of the charge questions. And a few reminders about this. We're not deliberating on these today in terms of how to address them. We're merely looking at them and thinking about are they sufficient? Are they clear? Do we understand what they're asking? Are there any that we should request a modification on, or are there any that need expansion to become more clear? Are there others that should be considered for addition, or are there any here that we don't think are pertinent? And then the process will be that this will be taken under advisement by EPA, and then EPA would return any revisions to us, and then these are what we would be using to guide us through our process. Now, as we go along, we're able to interpret these somewhat broadly as appropriate. But we do want to make sure that the charge questions are appropriate and reflect what we believe our task is in performing this review. So with that, then I just like to introduce these and go through each of the charge questions one by one. And so if I look at and I guess, Dr. Wong, we have a slide for these to present these, do we not?
Yes, we have the PowerPoint slides. So Will, can you show the PowerPoint slides? Yeah, good.
Okay, thank you, Will. Yeah. So the first of these is shown here. It regards systematic review methods and documentation. And it states that the IRIS Tox Review of Inorganic Arsenic describes and applies systematic review protocol to identify studies and to screen which of those are most pertinent. The protocol was described in section 1.5.1 and also more fully in Appendix A. And so it says, if applicable, please identify additional peer-reviewed studies of inorganic arsenic that the assessment should incorporate. And then it has a footnote there to talk about new identified studies and the notion that they're guided by meeting PICO criteria and so on. So any comments from the panel or questions about this first question regarding systematic review? So go ahead. I don't know who, I think Dr. Lee and Dr. Thayer's hands went up simultaneously. So I'll let you two duke it out.
Yeah, I think we have the same point we want to make. Janice, you go.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that actually we had slide 55 that goes over the different tiers for the charge questions. So if you could start on that slide, I think that would be useful. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So I guess, did this follow the previous slide? I didn't notice. Okay, but yes, this is the tier 1, 2, and 3 necessary for strengthening, encouraged to strengthen, so forth. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Pesson.
Yeah, I just want some clarity on whether EPA will accept mode of action studies as part of the recommendations, or are they somehow relegated to tier 4 or whatever it is that really won't be considered further in the risk assessment or in the document?
So it sounds like that was a question for Chris, perhaps?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take a shot at this, and then Andrew, just jump in here if you want to add anything. So I would say there's two things. One is that the tiering approach, that slide, we should go over it. The idea is that any charge question, as you're coming up with your recommendations, contextualize them in terms of a tier 1, which is really kind of essential. Tier 2 and tier 3, and we can go back through those. So that's a bit separate than the mechanistic question that you asked in terms of MOA. I would say that at this point, peer review has started. What we typically do is we can consider new science, but it really needs to be game changing, impactful to sort of the fundamental conclusions of the assessment to be fully considered. And Andrew, let me just pause and see if you want to add anything.
Nothing. I think you covered it. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Chris States.
I just want to mention Sam Cohen chatted me. He's connected, would like to make a statement.
Okay, let's finish with this particular question. And before we go on to the second charge question, we'll open the floor for his comment. Anything else from the panel regarding charge question 1? It's perhaps one of the most straightforward of them all. So. Okay, hearing none, then let's see if we truly have Dr. Sam Cohen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, hooray.
Yeah, the technical problems. I still can't unmute or unvideo, so I'll just sit through this. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today, despite all the technical difficulties. I'm from the University of Nebraska Medical Center. I'm a practicing surgical pathologist with nearly 60 years of basic research experience in chemical carcinogenesis, toxicology, and pathology, and more than 30 years investigating arsenic. I am commenting today on the lack of or minimization of consideration of mode of action in the IRIS assessment of inorganic arsenic, the issue that was just brought up. USDA and their interagency comments also brought up this concern. IRIS relies on epidemiology with modeling to estimate risk at low exposure. Extrapolation and modeling to low exposures requires a basic consideration of mode of action. I encourage the panel to carefully evaluate recent publications by Paulo Bofetta and by Kan Shao regarding dose-response evaluations of epidemiology studies. Dr. Shao was a co-author on one of the Allen et al. Papers that's being utilized by IRIS for this assessment, and his 2021 publication addresses some of the critical issues related to the IRIS approach. All agree that inorganic arsenic and its metabolites do not react with DNA, excluding direct genotoxicity as a mode of action. All other modes of action for chronic effects of inorganic arsenic, whether cancer or non-cancer, involve the covalent binding of trivalent arsenicals with sulfhydryl groups of proteins inactivating those proteins. This involves a threshold process. Since proteins are constantly being generated, an adverse effect will only occur when the rate of synthesis becomes less than the rate of inactivation, which will be the threshold. Any modeling of a dose response must incorporate the presence of a threshold, not just nonlinearity, but an actual threshold. A threshold has been best demonstrated in humans through studies of benign and malignant skin lesions, which are not even addressed in the IRIS document. Hake et al. Showed that no one in his West Bengal population with exposures to drinking water levels with less than 110 ppb inorganic arsenic developed skin lesions. This concurs with the lack of arsenic skin lesions in the 330 million Americans, of which most use drinking water with a maximum of 10 ppb of inorganic arsenic, but nearly all of whom have exposure considerably less than 100 ppb of inorganic arsenic in their drinking water. I hope that the SAB panel will carefully consider mode of action in the presence of a threshold in the consideration of their inorganic arsenic risk assessment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that you were able to provide your comments to the panel. before we move back to the considering charge questions, are there any clarifying questions for Dr. Cohen from the panel? Dr. Wyckoff.
Yeah, just a quick one. Dr. Cohen, you mentioned some interagency comments. Could you say again what those were?
You're muted.
Maybe not.
I heard him refer to USDA.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see if I can see from his text.
Yeah, that's okay. I can go back. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Let's move back then to charge questions. And if we can have the slides up again. Okay. So let me move back to my notes on charge questions. Okay. So bear with me here a minute. So charge question 2 deals with study confidence, conclusions, presentation, and the like. So the text is here, and it's rather lengthy. It speaks to the NASM review of the inorganic arsenic protocol. That bladder cancer, lung cancer were accepted as hazards, and only considered for the ability to update dose response analyses. Other outcomes were included for both hazard evaluation as well as dose response analysis. This includes circulatory system, pregnancy, diabetes, neurodevelopmental tox. And for these, the tox review provides an overview of individual study evaluations, and those are made using HAWK, which I think we should all have access to now. And so then we're asked to please comment on whether the study confidence conclusions are scientifically justified and clearly described, considering the importance of the methodologic features of the assessed outcomes. And then please indicate any study confidence conclusions that are not justified and explain any alternative study evaluation decisions. The second component of this then is stating that results from the individual studies are presented and synthesized in the health outcomes sections. And we're asked to comment on whether the presentation and analysis of study results are clear, appropriate, and effective to allow for scientifically supported synthesis of the findings across sets of studies. And is there a follow-on slide from this question as there was before or not?
No, there's not.
There's not. Okay, thank you very much. I'll probably be asking you that each time, Mr. King. Okay. Any clarifications needed for this? Any comments or questions from the panel? I think this one is pretty straightforward. And I personally don't find that there's anything ambiguous in this particular question. Anyone from the panel? Okay, Dr. States.
Yes. So I'm just wondering, in the context of this, are we to evaluate in terms of a response to the NASM review, or is this a completely de novo evaluation?
I think that I guess my sense, Dr. States, is that the EPA has been trying to be highly responsive to the NASM review and the suggestions that were made there. And if there's some reason to feel that they aren't being responsive to the NASM review suggestions, and without justification for that, that would be something that would be worthy of consideration. But this panel is not charged with sort of a a do-over on the NASM review, if that's the question.
Yeah, I guess, so fundamentally, we're working as a starting point, the NASM review recommendations, and have they responded appropriately to those recommendations? Is that?
Well, I think it's a little nuanced. You know, we're evaluating the document that's in front of us.
Right.
And the document in front of us was heavily influenced by the NASM review. And if there's some reason to think that the EPA has not been responsive to that NASM review and suggestions, that would be something that I think we could delve into.
Yeah, I guess we're saying the same thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Other questions or comments, clarifying suggestions from the panel? Okay. Hearing none, let's go to charge question 3. So this is for the non-cancer hazard ID. And so it states for each health effect prioritized for hazard identification and the assessment based on the protocol outlined below. Please comment on whether the available epi data have been clearly and appropriately synthesized to describe the strengths and limitations that presumably of each of those studies. Please also comment on whether weight of evidence decisions for hazard ID are scientifically justified and clearly described and appropriately consider health effects in susceptible subpopulations or life stages to the extent possible, given the data. So then 3A for diseases circulatory system, the review concludes currently available evidence demonstrates that inorganic arsenic causes cardiovascular effects. And it goes on to say the basis for that, ischemic heart disease, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease endpoints of atherosclerosis and repolarization abnormalities, or QT prolongation. And then for diabetes, tox review concludes currently available evidence demonstrates also that inorganic arsenic causes diabetes in humans given sufficient exposure conditions. And that's based on assessed exposure levels of 150 microgram per liter, showing an increased incidence of diabetes. Any comments, questions, Claire? Oh, well, let's just deal with the first A and B first, I guess, before we move on to B and C, or C and D. So any thoughts or comments on this? So again, I think that this is fairly straightforward in what the ask is. And addressing this will be intensive, but doable. Okay, let's go to C and D and look at those. So for pregnancy and birth outcomes, the available evidence indicates is the conclusion that it's likely causing pregnancy and birth effects. And we had some discussion already about what study or studies are available for that. This moderate epidemiologic evidence generally supports a weaker hazard judgment than if its evidence demonstrates, and is reached more, a specific judgment reached is more heavily influenced by other lines of investigation than when there's robust epidemiologic evidence. Notable uncertainty in this judgment without reviewing the other lines of evidence, which was judged to be out of scope. So the conclusion based on studies of humans that assessed exposure levels of 100 microgram per liter showed decreased fetal and postnatal growth or gestational age. Section D then pertains to the neurodevelopmental effects, where the review concludes the currently available evidence indicates, not demonstrates, that inorganic arsenic likely causes neurodevelopmental effects in humans given sufficient exposure. And this moderate epidemiology evidence generally supports a weaker hazard assessment And although there's notable uncertainty in the judgment without reviewing other lines of evidence, it is reasonable to judge that the available evidence indicates neurodevelopmental effects are likely caused by inorganic arsenic exposure, given sufficient exposure to inorganic arsenic. And that's based on studies of humans, assessed exposure levels less than 100 microgram per liter, showing cognitive and behavioral deficits in children and adolescents. So any concerns, comments, additions, subtractions to these from the panel? Okay. Hearing none, then let's proceed then with the next question. So this is Carol. Go ahead, Dr. Wood. Go ahead. I see your hand is up.
Yes, sorry. Are we supposed to comment on the difference between indicate and demonstrate on strength of evidence for those, or are those pretty set?
I think that, well, we could ask EPA, but my sense is that, this comes from that definition of robust, and so it follows directly. So I guess if one possibility is if we look at this and say we thought that a particular study or set of studies was more robust than they were judged to be, that would be something that could be discussed. But I think the movement from robust to evidence demonstrates is the established procedure, and we haven't been asked to comment on that. That's been widely peer-reviewed, I think. Does that answer your question or help clarify it?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Okay. Number 4. So this regards the meta-regression analyses. So the EPA performed the meta-regression analysis on bladder cancer, lung cancer, circulatory system, and diabetes, and presented these results. So we're asked to comment on whether the application of this Bayesian meta-regression analysis and the methods used to select studies for that are clearly described and whether they're scientifically justified. We're asked if there are additional publicly available studies that warrant consideration as basis of these analyses, that we should seek to identify those and provide a rationale for why we think they should be included. In 4B, we're asked to comment on whether the modeling approaches for the meta-regression analyses, including the calculation of the effective counts and the estimation of intake values, that account for the background and oral and dietary exposures, and the Bayesian methods themselves to estimate pooled slopes are scientifically justified and whether they're clearly described. And then the third part of the C, in applying the hierarchical Bayesian model, EPA selected priors for the pooled meta-regression slope such that the pooled slope could not be negative, reflecting the causal determinations for these diseases, these 4: bladder cancer, lung cancer, circulatory, and diabetes. So we're asked to comment on whether this decision is scientifically justified and clearly described. So are there comments on this? Yeah, go ahead. I think Mike Pinelli, you were up first.
Yes. So I have a couple questions about these. First one is particularly relevant to part B here, when we're talking about, they ask if the methods were, clearly described. Are we supposed to judge this as like a self-contained document, or are we supposed to judge it as if because these methods were published in scientific journals, right? If what they describe in combination with reading those articles are sufficient to understand what they did.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a matter of professional judgment. I mean, we all author peer-reviewed published papers that draw from the existing literature, but seek to expand on that and properly referenced it. And so I think that normally for these sorts of documents, it's expected that you should be able to have a basic understanding of it by reading it. And then if you need to dive deeper, that they've provided the citations, the appropriate citations to allow that deeper dive. So that, I guess that from my experience and opinion, that would be my viewpoint. But I think that's something that the panel as a group can talk about and try to decide if we think they provided sufficient detail above and beyond the peer-reviewed publications.
Okay. And then, so my other question is about part C here. So, is this supposed to be judged independent of the results? Because, you can go into your Bayesian analysis, right? And you have sort of your prior reflects your expectations, regarding the dose response relationship. But then when you get your results in the posterior, that could suggest that, it's what you thought initially it's not really agree with your data, right? So is this supposed to be, sort of that first part, just justifying it based on, previous knowledge before they actually ran the analysis, or is it supposed to consider both?
So that's a good question. I think we could invite EPA to provide comment on that. As a more of a frequentist than a Bayesian, I don't want to go there. Anybody from EPA, Chris, or otherwise?
I confess I was typing in the chat in response. EPA, is this a Chris question or is this for Alan and for the team? Or
I think it pertains to really this notion of selected priors for the Bayesian model and whether we're trying to evaluate those based on sort of the a priori point at time when those were determined, or sort of a after the fact evaluation of those. Have I got that right, Mike Pennell?
Yeah, that was my intent.
yeah, that sounds like an Alan question.
Okay, Alan, are you on?
Yeah, I think we're seeking comment on the priors that were used in the model. And just from a general stance, including the justification of the priors that we used initially, and any alternative conclusions that might be drawn given the modeling results.
So sort of if we knew then what we now know, what would we have done?
Yep.
So I guess it's both, is what I'm hearing.
Okay.
Thank you now. Okay, Dr. Navas-Asan.
Yes, thank you. Just a very small question. It's just for the terminology. I want to make sure what we need to comment on is related to the dose response meta-analysis. Just because the terminology meta-regression in meta-analysis terminology can refer to something else, like which factors and explain differences across different studies. And so I want to make sure that yeah, this is about the dose response meta-analysis.
Dr. Davis, Alan Davis, can you answer that?
Just in terms of a more appropriate terminology is appropriate for the modeling that was done?
Just because the meta-regression in the context of meta-analysis can be confusing. Like if you go to very well-known books on meta-analysis, they often use the term meta-regression as the technique that it used to identify sources of heterogeneity across different studies. In the pool estimates, if you do a pool estimates across different studies, then you can do a meta-regression to try to identify factors that explain that heterogeneity rather than the dose response meta-analysis. So, I mean, I assume you can use terminology in different ways as long as you explain clearly what you mean. But I wanted to make sure that I don't get confused myself, for instance, on what we are trying to do. And I saw that Michael just raised his hand, so maybe he can clarify also.
No, we brought this up when we reviewed the protocol, and I just want to make sure that that was taken under advisement.
Yeah, because I think you can just call this a dose response meta-analysis. It's easier terminology and it's clear, and nobody is confused with it.
So the suggestion is that we restate this or have EPA rewrite this to make it clear what meta-analysis we're talking about. That we're talking about dose response meta-analysis. That's the recommendation, correct?
Yeah, that would be my recommendation. I don't know if it's now the day to make that recommendation or
It
it's
is.
later, but that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, this is exactly the purpose of doing what we're doing right now. So, any response from EPA with regard to that suggestion?
Oh, we can make that change.
Yeah, okay.
I think we can make the change. The reason for that change is that meta-regression can be misinterpreted as meaning something else in the statistical realm. So is that right?
Yes. And so just to clarify exactly what it is that you're meaning here and what we're thinking you're meaning is dose response meta-analysis. Okay. Dr.
This is Samantha.
Yeah.
I just want to add to that. I just want to make sure we'll take a look at, anything in the charge questions should match the terminology we've used in the assessment. So we'll want to make sure we don't introduce confusion, but the point is taken. So we could take a look at that language and try to see where we can clarify, but we don't want to get things lost between the connection between the charge and the assessment materials.
Yeah, certainly. Fair enough. Thank you for adding that. Okay, good. Dr. Barton.
So this is the analysis that used the logistic, is that right?
Correct.
So what I'm wondering is in part B, where it's focused on the modeling approach and asks us to evaluate all these things, it seems like one of the things we should add in explicitly is the choice of the, however you want to word it, the choice of the equation that's applied versus alternative equations, something along those lines.
I think that would be within the ask here in 4B.
I agree. I think it fits, but I would like it to be explicit.
Okay. So do you have some specific language you could suggest along here?
Yes.
Something to
well, others like Mike, Dr. Pinnell are maybe better able to state it than me, but I think it's the equation or alternative equations, applied to the analysis.
Okay.
I think that can just be added to that list and be right. It could be like choice of link function for the response variable or something like that. But I agree. I think it's an important point to bring up.
Okay. Okay, I have a note with regard to that. Okay, anything else on this from the panel?
Actually, if I could comment on the first
Yes.
point about meta-regression analyses, I think regardless of what the document says, we should ask that this charge question state explicitly that it's the dose response meta-analysis. And it could then say, for instance, as a parenthetical, which in the document is referred to as meta-regression analysis. But I think we want the charge question to be absolutely clear, regardless of what's in the document.
Yep. Good comment. I have a note of that. Right, that pertains to what Dr. Jones was saying about not wanting to have different terminology, but we, through a parenthetical, as you said, which in the documents referred to as meta-regression analysis, we could make that clear. Okay. Anything else from the panel on this question? Okay, let's move to 5. So 5 refers to the life table analyses used to extrapolate estimates of the meta-regression pool slopes to the desired target population, which is described as the general US population. Says EPA provides the results of the life table analysis as extra risk values calculated for a set of discrete intake values of inorganic arsenic, as well as polynomial trend lines with equations for the extra risk curves, so that users can calculate extra risk values for each outcome at any dose they require. And this speaks to the use of the IRIS assessment for downstream by others within EPA. So for each outcome below, please comment on whether life table methods have been scientifically justified and clearly described. And these are the cardiovascular disease incidents, fatal CVD, IHD incidents, fatal IHD, and then age stratified mortality values were available for fatal events and were used in the life table analysis. Goes on to say the age stratified DCS morbidity values were not available, and so a single lifetime background risk value was used in the analysis for cardiovascular disease and ischemic heart disease incidence. And this value was 0.13 microgram per kilogram day, and a lifetime extra risk for CVD incidence of 2.1 times 10 to the minus 2 was estimated out of that. And then in B, Tox Review estimates extra risk at various doses for type 2 diabetes. Age stratified mortality and morbidity values were not available, so a single lifetime background risk value was used in the analysis, and that yielded lifetime extra risk diabetes 1.8 times 10 to the minus 2. So this is 5. There's 2 more sections to this. So let's take a look at those and we'll come back to this slide. Next slide, please. So then C under this is toxicologic review estimates extra risk for bladder cancer. Age stratified mortality, morbidity values were available from the life table analyses. We get 7.9 times 10 to the minus 4 estimated. And then for lung cancer, age stratified morbidity and mortality were available and were used in the life table, and this yielded a lifetime risk for lung cancer 2.4 times 10 to the minus 3. Okay, so let's back up one slide and just see if any panel members have suggestions, comments, questions about question 5, charge question 5. Really pertains to using life table analyses to try and assess risks across the US population at different ages. Any questions, comments on this one? Okay, hearing none, I think we can go forward then to question 6, which also pertains to life table analyses. Here for lung cancer and bladder cancer, linear trend lines are used to estimate a cancer slope factor. And these were estimated using only risk derived in the low dose region, given the nonlinearity at higher doses. There was a pretty good polynomial fit, and it wasn't terribly nonlinear, but nonetheless, it did seem to fit a line pretty well at the low dose region. So we're asked to comment on whether the selected cancer slope factors were scientifically justified and clearly described in the document. And fortunately, we saw those today. Any questions here or comments? Yes, Dr. Post.
That would be like separate from question 5, like assuming the risks or whatever in the life table and out, like we wouldn't be evaluating the life table analysis. It would be like assuming that's valid. Are the cancer slope factors done correctly, right?
Yeah, I think it really pertains to this issue of using the low dose region, which was modeled as a straight line, versus the polynomial, which include the whole dose range.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else on the panel? Any questions about or comments on charge question 6? Okay. Hearing none, let's go to charge question 7. This has multiple parts to it. It's got a A, B, and a C, and B has 2 parts. So let's take a look at this carefully. EPA calculated non-cancer RFD reference dose based on candidate values for each individual non-cancer health outcome, and presents these results. They determined that the data from Wasserman 2014 on developmental neurocognitive effects was not appropriate for candidate value derivation because of strong nonlinearity in the relationship between exposure and IQ scores. So we're asked to comment on whether this approach is scientifically justified and whether it was clearly described. That is the judgment that this was not appropriate for development of an RFD for that outcome, neurodevelopmental outcome. B is really estimating candidate values for DCS and diabetes. The meta-regression pooled slope upper confidence limit was used to calculate the 5% BMD05 and the BMDL05, respectively. So we're asked to comment on whether this approach and the organ-specific candidate values are scientifically justified and clearly described. And here are those values provided in 1 and 2. And I think here there was a question that was asked regarding the BMDL equation and seeking some clarification there. So I think that question has been asked, and we'll hope to get some input to address that question from the EPA folks. Then C for pregnancy outcomes, decreased birth weight was selected for benchmark dose modeling, and the study reported linear regression slope was used to come up with a BMDL05 of 0.23 microgram per kilogram per day. We're asked to comment whether that was scientifically justified and clearly described. So any suggestions, comments, concerns about question 7, charge question 7 from the panel? Yes, Dr. Barton.
So I just want to make sure I'm not sure that we need to revise this question depending on how we're as a group willing to interpret it. I have real concerns about how the RFD is described in the document as being a level protective without effects, essentially, as being inconsistent with the idea that you can calculate risks for the non-cancer effects. And so I think we should address the questions that are here in terms of how the RFDs are calculated, but I think we should also address the question of whether presenting these is consistent with the data analysis of the epidemiologic studies and the presentation of risk levels. And for instance, the summary statement on the EPA presentation that the risk levels for cardiovascular were far higher than for cancer. But you can calculate a cancer risk at the RFD, but you can't calculate from the RFD. You're told that the RFD is apparently without risk. Whereas the NASEM report did specifically suggest a risk-specific dose, where just like with cancer, you would say at this, we're going to consider a 10 to the -2 or a 10 to the -4 or a 10 to the -6 risk to be the sort of acceptable level that we will, regulate based upon. And as was stated in somebody's comments, that got pushback from other parts of the agency, but I don't think that should necessarily limit. And I would like to hear other committee members' perspectives on this question. So again, I think either we reword this question to add that explicitly into as the first section, as a new section A, or if people are willing to just interpret it as a broad evaluation of the question, then we don't need to reword the question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I'm trying to keep us from diving too deep into deliberations here today, but there's two answers to that question in terms of whether this is included. There's the "and clearly described" part. And so really it could be that your concern comes under that question as to whether it was clearly described or not. And in that sense, I would say that the charge question leaves that open to us to make that judgment. On the other hand, an argument could be made to request that be specifically called out. So let's hear from Dr. Post and see what you have to say, Gloria.
I'm not sure if this is if this shouldn't be discussed now and more at, excuse me, the in-person meeting, because as I said earlier, I didn't read the document yet. I just reviewed the presentation. Based on what Dr. Barton was saying about the risk-specific doses, is it assumed there's with the risk levels for non-cancer effects that it's linear and there's not a threshold, or that's not the case? I didn't read it yet, so I didn't know if someone could answer that.
Yeah, it's linear down to the lowest dose, and the epi studies cover the full range of doses. So that's how they come to that linear, no threshold dose response.
But the reference dose is lower than the lowest dose, I guess. It is contradictory, as Dr. Barton said. I don't.
Any other comments? So does anyone else have an opinion on whether we should just rely on the "and clearly described" to be able to raise any issues regarding Dr. Barton's comment, or should there be some explicit call out? And Dr. Barton, do you have an opinion as to whether we need to call that out specifically, or whether it's sufficient to have and clearly described?
Comfortable with going with and clearly described and scientifically justified for that matter, as long as you as chair are comfortable that having a discussion about this is not somehow out of the scope of this charge question. As long as you're comfortable that the discussion fits, then I'm happy to leave it as is.
Okay, I am very comfortable with that. So I have made a note of that, and I'm sure that you will feel free to bring that up when we deliberate. Okay, anything else with regard to question 7 that we need to address? Okay, hearing none, let's move on to question 8. It was just 9 questions, so we're making good headway as we move through these. Question 8 is shown on your screen. EPA has evaluated and applied where appropriate uncertainty factors to account for interspecies variability, differences, database limitations, duration, extrapolation from the lull to the null, and so the questions here, A and B, has uncertainty been adequately accounted for in the derivation of the toxicity values? Please describe and provide suggestions if needed. And we noted that in overall, most of these were set at 1 with the interspecies variability UFH as 3. In B, for DCS diabetes, EPA applied 3 to account for the individual differences in toxicokinetics and dynamics related to this in humans. They determined the higher was not necessary given that the studies that investigated non-cancer effects in sensitive populations were included in the meta-regressions for cardiovascular disease, ischemic heart disease, incidence, and diabetes. So it points out that for all 3 endpoints, the study that had the highest impact on the final pooled slope value was the one that investigated effects in a sensitive subpopulation. So we had, and then asked us to comment on whether this is scientifically justified and clearly described. And we had some back and forth on this point as to sort of the justification for 3 and this fact that there was, I think the point was raised that there are some SNPs associated with sensitivity to arsenic, and whether those SNPs were represented in the population that was studied in the EPI studies. The determination, I think, was that they were, therefore they set this at 3. So that's the essence of this question. Any comments, questions, concerns about the way question 8 is raised? This one might be a little bit easier than it is for some other iris compounds because of the extensive nature of the human epi data. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands go up. Let's move to question 9. So, there was a section 3, C, I apologize. I forgot about 8C. It's pretty much the same thing, except it's talking about the Bangladeshi population formed the basis for the point of departure for birth weight experiences at a much greater rate than the US population represents a sensitive population. Rest comment whether that approach is justified and clearly described. I think this refers to Wasserman studies. Anything on this? Okay, so let's go to the last question then, question 9. from the identified human health effects and the derived organ-specific toxicity values for diabetes, DCS, and pregnancy, an RFD 0.031 microgram per kilogram day was used, and that was based solely on the cardiovascular disease incidence. This RFD is expected to protect against all non-cancer adverse health effects associated with inorganic arsenic and across all life stages. So we're asked to comment on whether that RFD is scientifically justified and clearly described. Merely picking that one to be the basis and rather than any others or a combination thereof. Okay, so any comments or concerns about question 9? Okay, so hearing none, I guess the next step is for me to really ask the question, are there any of these that anyone feels are sort of entirely out of scope or inappropriate or unaddressable? Any thoughts about that, or if they are appropriate? And it seems to me that I haven't heard anything along the way of any objection to the inclusion of these, but this is our chance to at least consider that. Okay, so then the other question is there something missing here that we should be thinking about, that any major points that can't be included as a component of one of these 9 questions and their subparts? Any thoughts on that question? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands go up and not hearing anybody speak. So let me just pause here and ask the DFO, Dr. Wong, if we have addressed this agenda item in the way that we need to before we move on.
I think I saw Jeff Gibbs' hand up previously. I don't know whether he still want to make a comment first.
Okay, thank you. I missed that. Go ahead, Dr. Gift, if you have something.
Don't think I had my hand up, but I did want to clarify, if it wasn't understood, that both the non-cancer and the cancer analyses that we presented extrapolate down to 0 and provide those polynomial equations that you referred to be able to calculate or to estimate extra risk down below the RFD and down to 0. So, the RFD, as explicitly indicated in those plots, is not without risk. It's, I guess, the terminology is it's without appreciable risk is what the definition says.
Okay. Thank you for that. And you say they extrapolate down to 0. I thought the point was that there isn't extrapolation because there's data down to 0 being defined as background.
There's low dose data. There's maybe some data below the RFD, but it's when I say extrapolate, I'm talking about the extra risk equations that we present go down to 0. I mean, there may be data down there, but
okay, yeah. I'm just trying to be very clear about what we mean when you say extrapolation. Okay. So the outcome of this then, and I hope, Dr. Wong, you were also noting things, but what I got is that under question 4, we wanted to have this called out that it's a dose response meta-analysis. And if this differs in terminology from what was in the document, that we could have a parenthetical that says something like, which in the document is referred to as meta-regression analysis, or whatever's appropriate there. So we'll ask for clarification on that from EPA. And then under 4B, we had the question of the equation or alternative equations applied to the analysis, which was, and I'm not sure I got this language exactly right, but the link functions for the response variable. And maybe we could ask Dr. Barton or Pennell to provide some language here that would really address the question, because I'm not capturing it sufficiently. And then the third was the presentation of the risk levels, this question about cancer risk at the RFD and how this was defined by NASM, and the commitment was there that this could be discussed under the question as it was asked in charge question 7. So it doesn't require additional text or changes to the charge question, just a commitment to talk about that when we do evaluate whether this was sufficiently and clearly described. So those are the 3 changes that or 2 changes plus one commitment that I noted. Dr. Barton.
So in terms of language for 4B, if I'm a biologist, so if one of the statistical people could provide the language, but essentially the issue is the choice of the logistic equation versus other equations.
Okay. So I'm looking to Dr. Pennell, perhaps. Are you suited to address that?
Yeah, I don't think it's that much needs to be said. I mean, just within that list, whether or not the choice of like the logistic function for like the response probability, in addition to those other considerations, is appropriate, scientifically justified, or whatever the other descriptors are.
Okay. You talked much faster than I write. I'm sorry. Okay. Whether or not choice of logistic equation
for the response probability.
Response probability. Okay.
And then it can just be embedded in that list of things we're supposed to consider.
Yeah. Okay. Embedded in the list. Got it. All right. Thank you for helping me out there. Okay, we will communicate that to EPA.
This is Jeff. I just wanted to point out that the appendix where the other models are looked at is C1.1. I misspoke before. I said 1.2, but it's C1.1.
C1.1. Thank you for correcting that. That's good.
Well, C1.1.1, not C1.2.
C1.1.1.
Correct.
All right. Good. Good to get this precise. Okay. So let me ask if Dr. Wong or Dr. Brennan have anything that they want to state at this point, process-wise, adding to the next steps. Dr. Wong?
Well, seems to me that the changes to the charge question are really minimum. So And I think EPA can send us the revised charge question back very quickly, possibly early next week. And I have already asked the panel members to give me the preference for the charge question assignment. So I'm just waiting for a couple more people who haven't responded. So once everybody responded, then I can give out a charge question assignment. And then the panel members who start working on the assignment and prepare the individual response to charge questions. And
So let me just, I saw that Dr. Jones has come on.
yeah, I think she has something to
So
say.
I invite you to respond.
Thanks. And I think in general, that sounds good from what Dr. Wong was saying. I believe we were all taking notes just as you were, and it might be helpful if something can come over from the committee that kind of captures what you had, especially with some of that specific language, that we can kind of come back, really look through and think through the implications of that, and figure out how to bring in those clarifications to the charge and get that back over to you all.
Yeah, we'll do that. And you know, I think what we send over, embrace the spirit. And if there's slightly different language that you incorporate than what we provide, that's understandable as long as it, is responsive. So thank you.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Dr. Brennan, I saw your light go on and your lovely face. Do you have something?
Yes. Well, it's Mr. Brennan, but I will say that I thought that meeting went very well. I have nothing to add to the discussion right now. Thank you for leading everyone through the discussion.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Tom. Okay. So the next steps, of course, will be that the committee will each have their assignments as being primary or secondary, tertiary reviewers for each of the, not reviewers, but people to address the charge questions. We're dividing the task, and then we'll be working on that before the meeting in Washington later this month, 24th to 26th of January. And Dr. Wong has requested responses to the charge questions before that meeting. And then I'll be I'll be reviewing these as they come in and looking to see how much we have harmony or disharmony in terms of the various reviewers on the panel and their interpretation and review of these charge questions. And when we come together, then we'll do the deliberation. We'll do the deep dive into each of the questions and our draft responses to those, and seek consensus on our response to all of those charge questions. So that will be the task before us in the in-person meeting. So are there any questions about procedure going forward? Yes, Dr. Pennell.
Yeah, so that's kind of new to me, giving you the response ahead of time. So when is this? Did I miss that in the email? When do you want these by?
Dr. Wong, can you respond to that, please?
Yes. Usually, we ask the panel members to submit the individual comments to me and the panel chair at least a few days before our in-person meeting, so that I can compile all the individual response and then post the response on the meeting webpage. And so that the panel members, can review and all the comments provided by the other panel members before our deliberation. So a short answer is, yeah, at least a few days before the in-person meeting.
Okay, and this will just be like internally.
No, your individual comments, because we'll deliberate on those comments.
But they will be posted, correct?
Yeah, they will be posted. They'll be posted.
Oh, okay.
But they won't represent the final consensus, that will come through our deliberation. I realize it's a tight timeline. So for that, it is what it is. Yes, so Dr. States and then Dr. Post.
Yeah, I was just gonna comment on the timeline. That's 2 weeks.
Dr. Post?
I have the same question that Dr. Pinnell had. I think a lot of us might be really busy now because if we took a holiday break and now everything's like really starting up again with everything. So would it be possible that we could have until the Monday of the week of the meeting and then we could have the weekend to do it instead of the week before, do you think?
Oh, yeah, sure. Just do the best you can. I understand.
Before the meeting starts, but that would give like an extra weekend to work on it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's appropriate accommodation given just how extremely tight this is. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yes, Dr. Wyckoff.
Yeah, just a quick timeline. So sorry, just squaring this timeline. So when do we think we'll have the assignments? Because we're going to come back with final charge questions, and then when will we kind of be able to kind of get going, I guess is my question.
Well, as I say, I'm still missing the response from a couple of panel members. So when I get the response from everybody, then I will send it out, the assignment. So hopefully we'll be over the weekend or maybe early next week.
But I would say you can start.
But you know what your assignment is because it's based on your volunteering, right? So it's not. I asked you what to do, but then you told me what you want to do.
Yep. Okay.
So we will try to honor those things that you volunteered for primarily, and B, the charge questions. You know what they're going to look like based on what we reviewed and the slight changes we talked about. So I'd say the moment we adjourn, you can get started.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Pinnell.
I mean, I guess this is what it is. I mean, it's been quite a few years since I've been on one of these panels. I am a little uncomfortable about releasing some of these initial thoughts to the public because usually there needs to be some deliberations, and there's not some things that I don't always understand my first time through, and requires like talking to my colleagues on the committee.
Yeah.
And which doesn't happen until we get there in person.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. Dr. Wong, is this a
this is our usual procedure. So, so I mean, there's nothing unusual. I mean, a lot of people, they change the will after deliberation. So, but if this is just your initial thought, let's say the first step, in the deliberation.
Is this a FACA requirement?
No, not FACA requirement, but knowing that everybody will be doing their own homework, as you say, not much time. So, it's better everybody just do their own homework. And of course, the lead discussant who will have to go over, the response from the people in the team to provide a summary, of the response to the charge question.
Yeah, there's no doubt it would help the meeting, help us prepare for the meeting. But I think people are going to be working to do their evaluation right up to the Monday before travel to DC, and so it's going to be really tight. Let's hear from Dr. Karagas.
Would you mind reviewing for us the general timeline for this? We submit our individual comments. We lead a discussion or compile the lead.
I will compile all the comments.
I'll do the compiling, and then the lead discussion will lead during our in-person meeting. And then following the in-person meeting, can you just remind, is there like a timeline and steps outlined somewhere?
The general procedure is that after I receive all the individual comments, I will compile the individual comments and post it on the website so both the panel members and the public can look at it. And the lead discussant will then read over the individual comments for specific charge questions so that the lead discussant can provide a summary response during the in-person meeting. And of course, there will be deliberation, for every charge question so that the team or the panel will come to consensus for every charge questions. Okay, and after that, the writing phase will start. The lead discussant will be the lead writer, and they'll start writing based on what is agreed on during the in-person meeting. Okay, and of course, the write-up will have to be circulated to your team. They all have to review it and get a consensus. So when you reach consensus, then the lead discussant will send the write-up to me for that specific charge question. Then I will then put all the response to comments for every charge question together and put into the panel report. So that will be the start of our panel report, the draft panel report. Then of course, the panel chair will have to review it, edit, and so on. And then the first draft report will be posted on our website. And of course, after that, the panel will have another meeting, which will have to be scheduled. And then the entire panel will deliberate on the draft report. It will be a public meeting at that time. So I'm going as far as I can. And of course, after that meeting, and then the draft report have to be revised, right? And then before it finally sent to the charter SAB for quality review. So that is a general step.
Right. And so as chair, I would be presenting that to the SAB.
Right.
Their quality review, and then there'd be a subgroup of the SAB that would be looking at our report and essentially doing a peer review of our report.
But we don't know when that's actually going to happen. Like, we don't know, generally speaking. Are we talking about 6 months from now, or 3 months, or 2 months?
No, it's not going to be 3 months. That we know for sure. Usually about to start the meeting to final report about 9 months, January.
9 months.
Yes.
Okay. That's what I'm looking for, because I haven't done this before. So I just wanted to get a sense of the bigger picture of the time horizon. And then for our meeting in January, the end of January, it's a public meeting like this meeting where...
No, it's an in-person meeting. This is only a
It's in person. I
No,
mean,
but
it's
it
not
is
virtual, but it's still...
It's a public meeting, yes.
It's open to the public to come in
Yes,
person.
yes.
But it's not hybrid, so there won't be like a video cast.
No, it's a hybrid because some panel members, they're not able to come in person.
Okay.
Yeah, but we hope that as many as possible of the panel will be there in person, because the exchange is much more fluid and much more vibrant when we're in the same room together.
Yeah.
And there will be another opportunity for public comment. Public comment speakers will have 5 minutes at that meeting to present to us. And we think that there will be a few additional people than what we heard from today presenting at that. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, good question. I think, probably we should have said that without you having to ask us. So thank you for that. Dr. Post, your hand's up.
So based on the discussion today, I might want to comment on some questions that I didn't volunteer for. I just want to confirm that all of us can comment on any questions that we want to, even if we're not assigned to those questions.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Some people might not be as familiar, so I just wanted to make sure it was still the case.
Yes.
Okay.
We're just trying to split up the tasks so that nobody has to do too much heavy lifting. But this is a consensus report that we all have to weigh in on each and every aspect of it. So there's no restriction on comment and no limitation to just those parts where you were a primary, secondary, or tertiary. In essence, we're all tertiary reviewers. of every part. Other questions? Okay, I don't hear any more. I don't see any hands up. We are well ahead of schedule. So that's good. And so I think I will turn over the meeting to Dr. Wong to adjourn us.
Okay, well, actually, I just want to remind everyone that our next meeting is going to be January 24th to 26th. It's going to be in Doubletree Hotel, Arlington, Virginia. So it will be an in-person meeting. And of course, if some panel members cannot come in person, they can join by Zoom. So it'll be a hybrid meeting. So with that, I just want to thank the Inorganic Arsenic peer reviewers and the public listening online. And I would like to thank OLD team for the presentation and answering all the questions from the panel. And last but not least, I want to thank our panel chair, Dr. Peter Thorne, for leading us through the discussion and this and also this meeting. So we actually finished early.
Okay.
So
good.
so
Happy
this
Friday, everybody. Have a good weekend.
yeah, so this concludes our meeting for today, and then our next meeting will be on January 24th to 26th. So I call this meeting adjourned.